Ever since Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his special military operation against Ukraine in February 2022, the war has been marked by a brutal stalemate. Russia floods Ukraine with soldiers and equipment, while Ukraine valiantly defends its territory, occasionally launching counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. For nearly 30 months, this grinding conflict has followed a predictable pattern, largely because Ukraine was restricted from using Western-supplied weapons against targets inside Russia, a move that could have escalated tensions in Europe to a dangerous level. That's all changed. In a dramatic shift, US President Joe Biden, backed by other NATO allies like the UK, has given Ukraine the green light to strike back directly on Russian soil. This bold decision shatters the so-called red line that had held Ukraine back, and it's setting the stage for a turning point in the war. Ukrainian forces have crossed into Russia, targeting the strategic region of Kursk. This marks the first time since the war began that Ukrainian troops have moved beyond their own borders. So what does this mean for Putin? Why Kursk? And most crucially, what could this development mean for the future of the Ukraine war? Let's dive into these questions, starting with the most pressing one. What on earth is happening in Kursk? On August 6, 2024, Ukraine broke through the thin Russian line of defenses separating Ukraine from Kursk, allowing its soldiers to enter Russian territory for the first time. This breakthrough went underreported on the day that it happened, possibly because media outlets were taking a wait-and-see approach under the assumption that Russia would quickly push the Ukrainian forces back. That isn't what happened. A day later, The Guardian was among the first to properly report on the incursion, noting that the fighting in Kursk had entered its second day, with reports suggesting that Ukraine's forces had managed to advance up to 9 miles away from the border and deeper into the Kursk Oblast. That incursion had been made possible by a highway running north of Sverdlikovo, a Russian border village that also happens to be close to a key natural gas transmission hub. While those reports were unconfirmed at the time, The Guardian pointed out that both official and unofficial Russian sources were claiming that the incursion had happened and that it appeared to involve several hundred Ukrainian soldiers who had taken advantage of the fact that the border between their country and Kursk is one of the most lightly guarded, from the Russian perspective, on the entire front line. Russia was quick to claim that it had already neutralized the incursion. Its defense ministry claimed the incursion was neutralized on the day that it happened, only to backpedal by the time The Guardian released its report to claim that it was ongoing as of lunchtime on August 7th. Russia also provided details on what it had done to counter the offensive. It says using missile strikes and artillery, it destroyed 50 armored vehicles and inflicted 260 casualties on the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine remained tight-lipped about the entire operation. On August 8th, several other media outlets picked up on the story. These included Le Monde, a French news website, which claimed that Ukraine had actually sent 1,000 troops into Kursk, rather than the previously reported several hundred. It also reported more details on what Ukraine did once it crossed the Russian border. Backed by more than 2,000 soldiers that stayed on the Ukrainian side, defending their position and perhaps preparing to follow the initial 1,000 into Kursk, Ukraine crossed the border with 10 tanks and 20 armored vehicles. That immediately casts aspersions on Russia's claims to have destroyed 50 armored vehicles, showcasing just how difficult it is to ascertain full details of what's happened so far. Once Ukraine crossed the border, Russia declared a state of emergency in Kursk as soldiers advanced on several localities, including a small town named Sudza. These localities were bombarded with Ukrainian missiles and drones, reportedly causing at least 5 deaths and over 30 injuries. Furthermore, the August 6th incursion had resulted in fighting breaking out in Oleshnya and Goncharivka, both in the Kursk Oblast, with Russian soldiers in the latter region supposedly being surrounded and captured by Ukrainian forces. The next day saw Ukraine advance further, according to Le Monde, resulting in the capture of around 20 poorly defended Russian villages, including Gornal, Daryuno, and the previously mentioned Sverdlikovo. Those captures also led to Ukraine taking control of the Sudza gas station, a gas transfer point overseen by Russian energy giant Gazprom that represents one of the few entry points for Russian gas into the Ukrainian gas transmission system. This station matters because it's key to Russia being able to transport gas into Europe, meaning the taking of the station will put a small dent into Russia's profitable energy market. NPR also published a report on August 8th detailing the incursion. It backed Le Monde's claims of 1,000 Ukrainians entering Kursk, noting that the number comes from General Valery Gerasimov, who is Russia's chief of general staff. It also noted that it was the first such offensive carried out by Ukraine. Though it had previously backed small groups of Russian exiles as they carried out limited cross-border raids, the incursion into Kursk was the first time that Ukrainian soldiers had entered Russia since the war began. Putin was left with egg on his face. After spending so much of the war trying to portray Russia as an indomitable power to which Ukraine would crumble over time, he now finds himself having to explain why he's allowed Ukraine to take Russian territory. To rub salt into his wounds, the incursion is far from over. At the time of writing, Al Jazeera is running a live tracker covering the Ukraine war, which says the Ukrainian soldiers are still fighting Russians in Kursk. That tracker also contains a quote from Mikhailo Podolyak, a Ukrainian presidential aide, who pins the blame for the incursion on Russia. The root cause of any escalation, shelling, military actions, forced evacuations, and destruction of normal life forms, including within the Russian Federation's own territories like Kursk and the Belgorod regions, is solely Russia's unequivocal aggression, he wrote in a social media post. Al Jazeera also offers a different number for the tanks that have crossed the border, 24 instead of 10. So the details are still blurry. What we can say for sure is that Ukraine is in Kursk and that it's taken up to 1,000 soldiers over the border into Russia. Those soldiers are accompanied by tanks and armored vehicles, in addition to seemingly having access to missiles and drones. They've used these weapons well. Up to 20 small Russian villages are apparently under Ukraine's control, however temporarily that control might last, along with a key Russian gas station. All of this brings us to another key question. Why did Ukraine choose Kursk? That's a question that the White House has been asking. On the evening of August 7th, the US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, published an update on the incursion. It confirmed that US intelligence indicates that Ukraine has penetrated at least 2 of Russia's defensive lines on its sojourn into Kursk, as well as taking a stronghold. It also cited both satellite imagery and geolocation footage to apparently confirm the reports that Ukraine has taken dozens of captives and that it now controls the Sudza gas distribution station. These early reports have prompted the White House to contact Ukraine's leadership to quiz them on the objectives of the incursion. Speaking on August 7th, Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, noted, "We're going to reach out to the Ukrainian military to learn more about their objectives." She also pointed out that the White House supports what she calls common sense actions to stop Russia's attacks. Perhaps the use of the term common sense is a subtle indicator of what the US thinks about the incursion. After all, there appears to be little immediate military value to taking the territory within the Kursk Oblast outside of taking the previously mentioned gas distribution station. And even then, the value is minor. That station sends gas into Ukraine and has likely seen minimal use since the war started. Digging deeper into Kursk itself further demonstrates how it appears to hold minimal strategic value. Though the oblast covers 11,582 square miles, it only contains 1.061 million people, meaning it's far from one of Russia's major population centers. You could argue that its hilly surface and multiple ravines could provide some tactical advantage to Ukraine, assuming it wishes to use Kursk as the launching point for further incursions into Russia, but that seems unlikely. A force of 1,000 isn't what a country sends when it intends to take over an entire oblast. Kursk is a center for agriculture, with farms covering around 77% of its territory and mostly growing sugar beets and wheat, with some fodder crops thrown in for good measure. But again, that's nowhere near enough value to justify an incursion through which Ukraine intends to permanently hold the territory it's captured. Which brings us back to the question, what is Ukraine's goal as it moves deeper into Kursk? The answers don't necessarily have to do with Kursk itself, with the oblast simply being the most convenient available to allow Ukraine to achieve its objectives. Rather, as the BBC explains, the goal may be an entirely different piece of territory, Donetsk. Donetsk, which is part of the wider Donbass region, has been a key target for Russia ever since Putin's special military operation started, and symbolically the Donetsk region is somewhat tied to Russia. A large portion of its people are ethnically Russian and speak Russian as their primary language. Granted, those ethnic Russians don't make up the majority of Donetsk's population, unlike what we saw in Crimea in 2014 and beyond, but there's certainly a Russian influence in the region. After all, as DW points out, it was in Donetsk and the surrounding regions that opposition to Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution and the Maidan protests of 2013 and 14 were strongest. The Donbass itself has been no stranger to war even before Putin invaded Ukraine. 2014 saw pro-Russian separatists proclaim both Donetsk and Luhansk as people's republics independent of Ukraine, likely with the goal of integrating them into Russia. The point here is that Donetsk offers symbolic importance to Russia. With that symbolic importance comes a continued push to take the region since the beginning of the war. That's why Russia has committed so many soldiers to Donetsk. Tens of thousands of Russian troops have been poured into the region, with Russia also focusing on developing a nearly impenetrable front line through which it pushes against increasingly weakening Ukrainian resistance. Glide bombs pepper Donetsk daily, with the taking of Donetsk setting the stage for Russia's later successes in overtaking the fortress towns of Avdiivka and Bakhmut. In short, Russia is dedicating a ton of its resources to Donbass and Donetsk in particular, which makes what's happening in Donetsk all the more interesting since Ukraine entered Kursk. Speaking to the BBC, a military analyst named Mikhailo Zhirokov points out that Russia has been forced to redeploy some of the soldiers it had stationed in Donetsk following the Kursk invasion. If you look at the official reports, he claims, there were significantly fewer Russian glide bombs dropped in the Donetsk area. That means the aircraft which carry them are now elsewhere in Russia. Elsewhere is likely Kursk. Ukraine's Kursk incursion has been a success in terms of pulling Russian forces away from a region in which they were previously focused. That may have been the goal all along. Throughout the course of the Ukraine war, Russia has succeeded in focusing the brunt of the fighting in areas in which it wants to take. That's logical, as the invading force, Russia essentially forces Ukraine to react by sending troops to whichever areas on which it focuses. This natural ebb and flow of the war has resulted in Russia leaving scant defenses across some areas of the front line it shares with Ukraine. The northeastern borders, which Ukraine crossed to enter Kursk, were some of the most minimally defended of all. So what we're likely seeing with the Kursk incursion is Ukraine forcing Russia to divert troops away from regions that Russia considers a priority. In creating those diversions, Ukraine weakens the Russian front lines in Donetsk, perhaps opening the door for counterattacks against Russia's offensives. If nothing else, the diversions offer a reprieve to Ukrainian soldiers near Donetsk, who are being bombarded by Russia's glide bombs, giving them time to regroup and reorganize their defenses. Ukraine is essentially keeping Russia honest. It's forcing Putin to realize that he can't be complacent when it comes to taking on Ukraine. Any weakness he displays, such as not reinforcing the front lines near Kursk, can be exploited by Ukraine and used against him. That brings us to a secondary reason why Ukraine may have moved into Kursk. Ukraine is showing that it, along with many of its supporters, is unafraid of crossing a red line. We touched on this earlier when we talked about how several Western nations are allowing Ukraine to use their weapons to attack Russia in its own territory. Perhaps the Kursk incursion is an extension of that. Ukraine will not only fire missiles behind the front lines, but it will actively take Russian territory to show Putin that it's just as capable of invading and fighting within Russia as Russia is of invading Ukraine. Interestingly, Ukraine may even have a modicum of support from the US with this incursion. Though the US is still seeking answers from Ukraine, as we mentioned earlier, the White House also pointed out that the restrictions the US has in place for the use of its weapons in Russia's territory haven't changed. Tellingly, White House spokesman John Kirby went on to say that the Kursk incursion was not a violation of our policy. So the US is looking for common-sense answers, but Ukraine's actions are very unlikely to cause any tensions between it and its most powerful Western ally. So we have two potential reasons for the Kursk incursion so far. Ukraine has used it to stretch Russia's forces along the front lines, potentially relieving pressure in Donetsk. And also it may be using the incursion to showcase just how far it and its Western allies are now willing to step over the red lines that previously prevented Ukraine from doing anything but defend itself against Putin's special military operation. But there's another reason why Ukraine may have chosen now to take territory in Kursk: negotiations. In May 2024, reports started surfacing about Putin being ready to end the Ukraine war through a negotiated ceasefire that would recognize the front lines at the time. From that ceasefire, Russia would enter deeper negotiations that would likely see it try to claim the Ukrainian territory it controlled at the time. That would have seen it essentially take much of the Donbass, including Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as southern regions such as Mariupol. In other words, Russia had a powerful negotiating position. No matter how faltering its invasion of Ukraine may have been, it had still successfully taken territory and was now ready to end the war, claiming that territory permanently. Reuters noted that several sources inside the Kremlin believe Putin was ready to push for these negotiations. One of the five it spoke to claimed, "Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire, to freeze the war." Putin himself had practically said as much during a May press conference he held in Belarus, in which he said, "Let them resume," when talking about the possibility of negotiations opening. However, that resumption could only happen if the negotiations were based on the realities on the ground. Ukraine would have to cede territory for Russia to stop. And worst of all, Ukraine had no leverage that it could bring to the negotiating table. With the taking of around 20 villages and a key gas distribution system in Kursk, Ukraine now has leverage. It's possible that Ukraine has taken this territory intending to hold it for the long term. If that's the case, we'll see more troops funneling into Kursk in the coming days. Remember that Ukraine sent an extra 2,000 to support the 1,000 who entered, and more territory taken. Should Russia and Ukraine enter negotiations while Ukraine still controls this territory, it finally has some leverage to bring to ceasefire talk. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky could tell Putin that he would be willing to trade the territory in Kursk for some of the Ukrainian territory Russia has taken. Whether that approach would work, or if Russia would be willing to enter negotiations when Ukraine controls some of its territory, remains to be seen. Which brings us to the final big question we'll ask in this video: what comes next? Russia's response, for one thing. In the immediate aftermath of the Kursk invasion, the oblast's regional governor, Alexei Smirnov, declared a state of emergency. He claimed the move was necessary to eliminate the consequences of enemy forces coming into the region. Air alerts were issued over Kursk, with Russia scrambling fighter jets, which the BBC says were filmed flying low to the ground over the region on the hunt for Ukrainian soldiers. This footage lends credence to Mikhailo Zhrokov's claims that Russia was diverting fighter jets from the Donetsk region to handle its Kursk crisis. Meanwhile, Ukrainian politicians have found themselves just as curious about the reasons behind the incursion as everybody else. Speaking on Facebook, Alexei Honcharенko, a member of Ukraine's parliament, claimed the attacks has led to the taking of territory before adding that he didn't know what the plan was. However, he claimed it would show Europeans and Americans that Russia can and needs to be attacked. Again, the message here is to support Ukraine in crossing even more red lines. After all, this is the first time since World War II that any Russian territory has been occupied by an opposing force. And as Honcharенko points out, Putin did not turn to nukes and so on, meaning Ukraine is showing the world that the world should not be scared of escalation or the reaction of Putin. Another humiliation for Putin. Despite all of the threats he's made during the war, which have included threats of deploying tactical nuclear weapons, red line after red line has now been crossed. Now he has Ukrainian troops in his territory and he hasn't followed through on any of his threats. Is that because he's smart enough to know that going nuclear would lead to World War III? Or is he not following through on his threats because he knows that Russia couldn't handle a war with NATO and the US after having depleted itself so thoroughly in Ukraine? Back in Russia, Andrei Belyusov, who became Russia's defense minister in May 2024 after previously serving as the country's first deputy prime minister for 4 years, faces his first major test. Part of passing that test appears to be taking part in the Kremlin's efforts to turn the incursion into pro-Russian propaganda. Putin is spearheading this campaign, claiming on the second day of the incursion that Ukraine's actions were not only a major provocation, but that its soldiers were firing indiscriminately at civilians, their homes, and Kursk's public buildings. Those claims aren't yet confirmed. Militaristically, Russia has clearly sent forces into Kursk to push back the Ukrainian advance, though it's unclear how successful they've been. Valery Gerasimov, Russia's chief of general staff, claims that Russia is continuing to destroy the adversary in areas directly adjacent to the Russian-Ukrainian border. That's a statement vague enough to suggest that Ukraine is still in Kursk and Russia hasn't been able to repel the 1,000 soldiers in the territory just yet. Even worse for the Kremlin is that these public claims of pushing back Ukraine are being disputed on Telegram, which is Russia's most popular social media channel. Several pro-war channels on the network claim the situation is far worse for Russia than the politicians are claiming. One such channel, Rybar, says that the situation is continuing to deteriorate, while noting that Ukrainian formations were advancing towards towns. Again, those claims aren't confirmed either. It all adds up to a confused state of affairs, in which we know Ukrainian soldiers are in Kursk, but we're still uncertain exactly how successful or otherwise they are following the initial taking of villages and a gas distribution station. Add claims of captured Russian soldiers into the mix and you get even more confusion. An August 9th report in the Kyiv Independent claims that drone footage published by Ukraine shows 32 captured Russian soldiers, adding that the Telegram post that showcased the footage claimed that a further 8 were out of frame. More claims were being made, but they offered yet another example of claims that can't be verified independently. What is clear is that the Kursk incursion shows a change in Ukrainian tactics. For over 2 years, it has bedded into its own territory, fortifying to enable it to defend against slow Russian advances. That approach has proved lethal for Russia. It's lost 588,540 soldiers since the start of the war, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. But now, whittling away at the seemingly never-ending stream of soldiers Putin is sending into Ukraine isn't enough for Zelensky. The incursion into Kursk shows that Ukraine is willing to go on the attack, which will send shockwaves throughout Russia as Putin realizes that his country is no longer safe behind the front lines of the Ukraine war. That change in approach could lead to consequences for Ukraine in the long run. That could especially be the case in Africa, where the BBC claims Ukraine has been trying to win allies during the war with Russia. Over the last 3 days, Mali and Niger have both cut diplomatic ties with Ukraine, ostensibly over comments by a Ukrainian military official who suggested that Ukraine may have played a role in the killing of several dozen Malian soldiers in July 2024. Those soldiers were working alongside mercenaries from the infamous Wagner Group and were apparently killed in clashes with Al-Qaeda-linked militants. Andriy Yusov claimed in the immediate aftermath that the separatist rebels the Malian soldiers fought received the necessary information they needed to carry out their attacks. An unsubstantiated comment, but one that has triggered Mali, Niger, and Senegal to cut ties with Ukraine, all coincidentally right as Ukrainian troops entered Kursk. It's possible that the Kremlin put pressure on all three to do so, with Ukraine calling Mali's decision short-sighted and hasty, while claiming that it complies with all aspects of international law. Perhaps Ukraine wasn't involved in the killing of Malian troops at all. Instead, we may be seeing Russian influence-based politics at play again, as it labels Ukraine as the aggressor while using the Kursk incursion to prove its point. Ukraine loses 3 potential African allies, or at least 3 countries with which it could deepen diplomatic ties, and Russia forces a small propaganda victory. That's all conjecture, but it shows that Ukraine's differing approach to handling Russia could have ramifications on a wider scale. What isn't conjecture is that Ukraine's latest actions aren't part of the Russian plan. None of this is. The special military operation in Ukraine was supposed to be short, sharp, and devastating. Now Russia is bogged down in a protracted war that has not only costed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and huge amounts of military equipment, but is now seeing it lose territory to a country that it's trying to conquer. The plan is failing. And with that, we'll ask you what you think about Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. Is this the start of a new approach that will see Ukraine taking even more Russian territory in the future? Or is it a short-term crossing of a red line designed to stretch Russia's troops? How do you think Putin will respond to the humiliation he's experienced as a result of this incursion? Share your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. It's August 6th, 2024. The date marks the first time that Ukraine's pilots have started flying F-16s, an event that many see as a potential turning point for the Ukraine war. Granted, the limited number of F-16s provided to Ukraine by its Western allies won't allow it to establish full aerial superiority over Russia. But now it has options. Localized superiority is possible, as are aerial attacks on Russian encampments and even Russian territory. It's a big moment for Ukraine. But soon the arrival of F-16s is going to be overshadowed by Ukraine making a move that nobody expected. Ukraine is about to invade Russia. Specifically, its forces are going to break the front lines to the north of the country and pour into Kursk, a Russian oblast that is sparsely populated and even more sparsely defended. Russia hasn't placed much importance on the region, instead preferring to focus most of its invasion efforts in Donetsk as it continues a slow push toward Kyiv. But the night of August 6, 2024 changes everything. Ukraine officially holds Russian territory. In this video, we're going to explain why Ukraine's invasion of Russia has changed the entire complexion of the war, to the point that Putin may never fully recover, and explain why it's such a crucial event. But before we do, we'll start with a quick recap. On August 7th, reports started circulating that Russia had supposedly repelled a group of 300 Ukrainian fighters, supported by tanks, that broke through the front lines in the north of Ukraine and entered Kursk. Russian officials claimed the Ukrainian offensive resulted in 5 deaths and 20 injuries, but the implication was that it had been successfully fought off. The implication was wrong. As more details emerged about Ukraine's unexpected foray into Russian territory, it was quickly revealed that this was no small attack. For Russia, the situation was far from controllable, despite the words of Kursk regional head Alexei Smirnov. Instead, Ukraine hadn't just gotten into Russian territory, it was advancing at a rapid pace. Intense fighting marked August 8th, with more details rapidly emerging. The French news outlet Le Monde revealed that Ukraine's incursion involved as many as 1,000 soldiers, with a further 2,000 backing that initial group up from behind the Ukrainian border, and that the invasion was of a far larger scale than Russia claimed. It has also been remarkably successful. Ukraine had pushed 9 miles into Kursk, taking 20 villages along the way. Among those villages was the small town of Sudza, which is home to a gas transmission station that Russia used to send natural gas to the rest of Europe. Far from controlling the situation, as Smirnov claimed he would, the Kursk regional leader instead declared a state of emergency. Thousands of Russians have been evacuated from their homes so far, indicating that Russia has failed to prevent the Ukrainian advance, despite all of its claims to the contrary. The advance has continued to August 13th, the date of the scripting of this video. Between August 8th and now, Ukraine has launched multiple drone and artillery strikes against locations in Kursk. It's also advanced even further into Russian territory. August 9th saw the Institute for the Study of War claim that Ukraine had pushed on from the initial 9 miles it had captured, with its soldiers advancing as far as Kromskaya Baiki, which is over 21 miles into Russian territory. That day also saw Ukraine officially confirm the invasion, with the country having remained tight-lipped during the initial 3 days of fighting. More attacks followed in the coming days. Russia claimed that the UK was helping Ukraine with its invasion, with State Duma member Adalby Shagashev saying that English had been heard among the soldiers. That isn't confirmed, and it's just an indicator of just how much chaos Ukraine's forces are spreading throughout Kursk. The strategy was also unfurling. Ukraine was sending small groups of soldiers into villages, bypassing Russian fortifications in the process before fighting and withdrawing to attack elsewhere. Those small groups were being followed by larger ones, which consolidated and kept the territory the smaller groups attacked, as Russia's forces found themselves further spread out and confused. This was no quick raid. Ukraine was actively capturing and keeping territory in Russia. Russia responded by sending more forces to the Kursk region, diverting soldiers who had previously been on the front lines in Donetsk in an effort to tackle the emerging problem. Those diversions haven't stopped Ukraine. Over the last few days, it's expanded its incursions to include the Belgorod region, another Russian oblast close to the Ukraine border, which is now seeing small groups of Ukrainian troops launching attacks and taking territory. Today, there may be as many as 6,000 Ukrainian soldiers occupying territory inside Russia. Over 76,000 civilians have been evacuated, with many en route to Moscow, and Ukraine is claiming that it continues to take territory. On August 12th, Commander Alexander Syrsky, who is one of Ukraine's leading military minds, claimed that Ukraine controlled 28 villages and a staggering 386 square miles of Russian territory. Ukraine had taken a massive gamble with this invasion. Faced both with encroaching Russian forces in Donetsk and the possibility of international blowback over it finally taking the role of aggressor in its fight against Russia, it rolled the dice. It gambled that it would not only be able to get away with fighting in Kursk, but that it would also successfully capture Russian territory without Putin resorting to nuclear weapons. It also gambled its relationship with its Western partners. Crossing the final red line had the potential to anger some of the countries that have provided weapons and financial support to Ukraine. The gamble paid off. Ukraine officially holds Russian territory. And even more worrying for Putin, he's had to watch as his forces have crumbled, and the responses that he's attempted to muster have not only failed to dispel Ukraine's forces, those responses have also failed to stop Ukraine from pushing even further. The Kursk invasion has changed everything. Putin has suffered the biggest humiliation he's ever experienced as Russian leader, and it's a humiliation from which he may never recover. Why? It all starts with exposure. Ukraine's actions in Kursk have exposed Russia's military as being far weaker than anybody anticipated. Of course, you could argue that the entire war has been a cavalcade of this type of exposure for Russia. When Putin first launched his special military operation in February 2022, much of the world assumed that it would be over quickly. After all, Russia had a far larger, and on paper, much stronger military. Even today, Russia has 1.32 million active military personnel compared to Ukraine's 900,000. With rounds of conscription leading to more being called up as needed, Russia has more than 10 times the number of aircraft, as well as 13,000 more tanks and more than 139,000 more armored vehicles. It should have steamrolled through Ukraine, even with the military support Ukraine is receiving from Western nations. Instead, we've seen a protracted war in which Russia has failed to establish any sort of aerial dominance. As the Journal of the JAPCC points out, Russia quickly started losing not only its outdated Su-25s, but also its far more modern Su-30s, Su-34s, and Su-35s when fighting Ukraine. The losses were so bad that Russia resorted to launching aerial attacks from behind the front lines. It uses glide bombs, old Soviet-era bombs fitted with a modern wing mechanism, to assault Ukrainian fortifications rather than risking its helicopters and fighters. That shouldn't have happened. With its aerial might, Russia should have been able to support its troops on the ground with precision strikes from its fighter jets, but it's failed to do so. Russia has also lost about a third of the Black Sea Fleet to Ukrainian missile and drone strikes, meaning the small naval component of the war that should have been in Russia's favor has become largely irrelevant. On the ground, Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claims that Russia has lost around 594,400 soldiers, along with nearly 8,500 tanks, over 16,000 armored fighting vehicles, and around 16,800 artillery units. Then there's the increasing reliance on Soviet-era equipment. Reports suggest that Russia has resorted to using old T-55 tanks, which are 65 years old and far from capable of serving in direct assaults against Ukrainian positions due to their thin steel armor being easily penetrable by even basic rocket-launched grenades. That's without mentioning the more modern drones and weapons Ukraine has been using to take out Russian tanks. In short, the entire war has offered humiliation after humiliation for Putin, with his increasingly aging stocks of equipment failing to achieve the victory the world assumed would have happened long before now. Fast forward to today, and the Kursk invasion further exposes Russia's weakness. It shows that Russia has failed to properly fortify the entire front line, which stretches around 620 miles. To the north, in particular, Russia didn't dedicate enough manpower or equipment to guarding the front line, allowing a small contingent of Ukrainian soldiers to break through and enter Kursk. It was too focused on Donetsk and too complacent elsewhere. Now it faces attacks on its own territory that would have been unimaginable when the war began. It gets worse for Putin. Not only does Russia face attacks in its own territory, but it's failing to fend them off. Ukraine is advancing through Kursk, as well as encroaching into Belgorod. Russia is actively losing villages and townships, showing that its faltering attacking might is matched by a lack of proper defenses behind the front lines. From there, add the lack of Western response to these attacks. None of Ukraine's allies have come out to oppose the strikes, with the biggest response being a request from the White House for Ukraine to provide details about its objectives for the Kursk region. That's more bad news for Putin. It shows that the West believes he's too weak to do anything about Ukraine invading Russian territory. Now Putin's threats, which he has repeatedly failed to follow up on, seem even weaker than they did before, as the Russian leader instead faces the humiliation of allowing a war he started to come to his doorstep. All of this brings us to the second reason why the Kursk invasion represents a pivotal moment for Putin as Russia's leader. It represents the crossing of the final red line in the Ukraine war. These red lines are the actions that have been taken throughout the war that the West believed would provoke Putin into further action. Providing military aid to Ukraine was considered a red line at the war's beginning, leading to several countries choosing to only offer non-lethal equipment. That red line has since been thoroughly crossed. Ukraine has now received over $121 billion in aid from Europe, along with about $82 billion from the US, with more incoming. Other supposed red lines included the installation of NATO infrastructure in Finland and Sweden, which is now extremely likely given that both have become NATO members since the war in Ukraine began, and Western countries allowed Ukraine to use the weapons they provide in Russian territory. All of those lines have been crossed. Putin has done nothing about them. With Ukraine's advancement into Kursk, the final red line in the Ukraine war has disappeared, and Putin quickly revealed that he will once again do nothing in response. At least he'll do nothing to the West. For all of his bluster about what such an incursion could mean in the context of a global war, Putin has barely been able to summon defenses against a few thousand Ukrainians within his border. Ukraine continues to advance as Putin looks weaker than ever. The invasion is a humiliation. It's something that not only should have never happened from a militaristic point of view, as Russia was supposed to be so strong that Ukraine would never break through the front lines, but it's also an invasion that represents humiliation for Putin geopolitically. His lack of follow-through on his threats throughout the war has shown the West that Russia's leader likely believes that his military isn't capable of taking on the rest of Europe. And psychologically, as the Atlantic Council points out, this crossing of the final red line also strikes a powerful blow against enemy morale. Russia, having already seen its military fail to defeat Ukraine quickly, now has to contend with mass evacuations and the panic that comes with having an invading force in its own territory. Putin's failures have forced his people to experience a taste of the medicine he's trying to deliver to Ukraine. The result is a growing lack of appetite for the Ukraine war in Russia itself. This was revealed by Euronews in December 2023 when it reported on a poll conducted by the independent company Chronicle. That poll discovered that support for the Ukraine war in Russia had nearly halved since a similar poll conducted in February 2023. Speaking to 1,199 adults across Russia between October 17th and 22nd, the Chronicle found that those who expressed consistent support for the war dropped to 12% from the previous result of 22%. What's more, 40% of those surveyed supported Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine, even if Russia's war objectives weren't achieved. The poll also revealed that 33% of Russians were against exiting Ukraine now that Russia is there, but even that number fell substantially from the 47% seen in February 2023. These dismal numbers, from Putin's perspective, were recorded before Ukraine invaded Kursk. With the final red line disappearing into the distance, it's only logical to assume that even more Russians will now want the war to end because they're scared that their homes could be next on the Ukrainian agenda. And as if to add all of these problems for Putin, America's response to Ukraine's actions has been flippant at best. Beyond the previously mentioned inquiries from the White House, August 13th saw President Joe Biden tell reporters in New Orleans that the invasion is creating a real dilemma for Putin. While the US has been quick to deny any involvement in the operation, "We had nothing to do with this," said White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre. This is far from the response Putin would have wanted. The US should have been on Ukraine's back from the moment it crossed into Russian territory. It was meant to warn Ukraine that this was an escalation that couldn't be tolerated, while telling them they needed to get out and only fight to defend Ukrainian territory. None of that happened. So Putin is left with a situation where the West isn't trying to stop Ukraine from invading, which tells him and the Russian people that the West isn't afraid of Russia anymore. The tentative approach taken at the beginning of the Ukraine war has evaporated. The red lines are all crossed. Putin has done very little in response other than continue his special military operation, and the Russian president's humiliation runs deeper. He's even had to deal with his own people losing their appetite for the war, even long before it arrived in their country. Russian morale is low. Putin's position as a strongman in Russian politics is now on shaky ground. And even worse for Russia's leader is that there are even more issues that the Kursk invasion has caused. Issues like Ukraine forcing Russia to change its strategy. As the National Interest pointed out in an article on August 10th covering Ukraine's high-stakes gamble, the incursion into Kursk may have been as much a strategic play as it was a move designed to expose Russia's weaknesses. On August 1st, Al Jazeera reported that the last week of July 2024 saw Russia launch the largest assault in 8 months within the Donetsk region of Ukraine. That assault was successful, as it led to Russia claiming several Ukrainian settlements and brought Russia closer to cutting off key supply lines that are helping Ukraine's troops fight against it in Donetsk. With those supply routes cut off, Ukraine would be forced to withdraw from the region en masse. Donetsk has been a key Russian focus for much of 2023 and into 2024. Earlier in the year, it managed to take Avdiivka, which many saw as a key Ukrainian fortification. That followed the taking of Bakhmut in May 2023, a similar fortified location that was key to Ukraine's defenses. Through these advances, it's clear that Russia is attempting to slowly take territory in Ukraine's east and south. By taking these fortified towns, Russia can press its advantage because it now has multiple launching points for offensives in southeastern Ukraine. August 4th brought with it more bad news for Ukraine in Donetsk. The country was forced to order the mandatory evacuation of children, along with their guardians, from Donetsk's eastern region in the face of Russian advances. More villages were falling, and more locations were being bombed. Ukraine has been standing on the edge of losing one of its territories for months now. Russia has even claimed that it successfully annexed Donetsk back in 2022, even though it still doesn't have full control of the territory. Why does any of this matter in the context of the Kursk invasion? Russia's advancement through Donetsk had forced Ukraine into a position where it couldn't make any significant breakthroughs in the south or east. Russia's forces are simply too strong in those regions, with Russia also sending a seemingly never-ending supply of manpower to the region to fortify the positions it takes. Enter the Kursk invasion. By committing so many people to Donetsk, Putin failed to properly supply the troops occupying the northern front lines. That paved the way for Ukraine's forces to break through and into Russia. Now that Ukraine is in Kursk and taking territory itself, Russia will be forced to divert forces away from Donetsk to defend itself. Forces and equipment will have to go north to fight back against the invading forces in Kursk, with much of those resources coming from Donetsk. Thus, Ukraine gains new opportunities. It weakens the fronts in the south and east of its territory, opening up the possibility of counterattacks that could allow it to reclaim some of the territory Russia has taken in Donetsk. It also forces Putin into a strategic rethink. For the entire war, Putin has operated under the assumption that Ukraine posed no threat to Russia. He could afford to dedicate more troops to one region than another because all the fighting would take place in Ukraine. So what if the front lines to the north were poorly equipped? Even if Ukraine pushed them back, it would never break through and actually enter Russia. Except it would. And it has. The Kursk invasion has changed the entire complexion of the war in that regard. Now Putin has to account for the possibility that Ukraine will enter other areas of Russia, meaning he can't afford to allow any sort of weakness across the front line. On a practical level, that means Russia is going to need more soldiers and more equipment, the latter already being an issue, given that the country is relying on Soviet-era equipment and is rapidly seeing its stockpiles dwindle. The alternative is that Russia will have to spread its troops further across the front lines of the war. While that will strengthen some areas, it'll also mean pulling soldiers away from regions that Russia wants to take. The result is likely going to be a net loss, as Russia is less effective in the areas in which it wants to advance because it's being forced to guard itself against Ukrainian incursions elsewhere. For the first time since the war began, the issue of where the fighting takes place is no longer in Putin's control. Ukraine had taken the initiative and shifted the war's momentum in ways Putin couldn't have anticipated. He was happy to keep throwing soldiers into the meat grinder while whittling away at Ukraine's defenses in Donetsk. That's still an option, though it comes with the ever-increasing threat that Ukraine will break through elsewhere. That brings us to another way that Ukraine's Kursk invasion has changed everything. It's the first time since February 2022 that Ukraine has had any leverage. In May 2024, Reuters reported that several sources within the Kremlin believed that Putin was open to negotiating a ceasefire with Ukraine. One of those sources, who remained anonymous, claimed that Putin can fight for as long as it takes to claim Ukraine, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire to freeze the war. Putin himself seemed to confirm this when quizzed about the source's comments while in Belarus, saying that peace talks could resume, but only if they were based on the realities on the ground. This was Putin's way of telling the world that he would have all of the leverage in any negotiations that took place. Russia had already taken much of South Ukraine and was advancing deeper into the Donbass. He was in a position of power. Putin could set the terms because Ukraine had no leverage aside from the aid it was receiving from the West. That changed on August 6th. Ukraine now controls 28 villages in Russia, and is still advancing through Kursk, along with a key gas transmission station. If negotiations were to begin now, it would finally have something to hold above Russia. Ukraine could ask for Russia to withdraw from some of the locations it's fortified in Donetsk in return for Ukrainian soldiers withdrawing from Kursk, for instance. That leverage couldn't come at a better time for Ukraine. It faces the possibility of Donald Trump being re-elected as US president, which creates uncertainty that isn't helped by Trump's claims that he could end the Ukraine war within a day if he was elected. Nobody knows what that means, and Ukraine is rightfully wary of what a change in the political structure of the US could mean for the support it's receiving from America. That uncertainty is compounded by events in Europe, the national interest points out. Several European countries that support Ukraine are due to hold elections, or have already held them, in 2024. Leadership changes could create problems for Ukraine, as those changes lead to the re-examination of support these countries are delivering. Add to that the fact that Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán now holds the European Union's rotating presidency. Orbán has maintained ties with Putin throughout the war, to the point where he would be considered something of an ally to Russia. As recently as July 2024, the Hungarian Prime Minister traveled to Moscow and shook Putin's hand in what Orbán calls a peace mission. This is a man who already blocked the EU from sending $55 billion in aid to Ukraine in December 2023, and it's very likely he'll argue to continue for the EU to limit the funding it provides to Ukraine in the future. These changing political tides must worry Ukraine. So by taking territory in Kursk, it's working to minimize the impact that changes in European or US politics might have. That's bad news for Putin. He was likely relying on his friendly relationship with Orbán to limit the support the EU could provide, while hoping for political turmoil in the US to do the same. He didn't account for Ukraine gaining leverage outside of its Western allies, meaning he has to face up to the fact that his position at the negotiating table has changed. He's still in the driver's seat if negotiations do occur, but now he would likely need to concede territory in Ukraine to regain the lost territory in Kursk, essentially setting the slow advances made in Donetsk back again. And this brings us to the final reason that the Kursk invasion has changed everything about the Ukraine war, why it's such a massive humiliation for Putin, and why he may never recover from the situation. Putin has lost his strongman image. We've touched on this concept already. In politics, a strongman is a leader, typically authoritarian, who not only claims to have strong popular support, but relies on military enforcement to maintain their control. Through that military support, they're able to claim themselves as the only person who is capable of solving whatever a country's problems may be. In Putin's case, that problem has changed over the years. Earlier in his reign, he tackled issues related to Russia's economy, but from the late 2000s through to today, that problem has evolved to focus on Russian sovereignty. Putin's invasion of Georgia in 2008 saw him cast himself as the strongman while waging war against another nation. The same goes for the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Putin was taking back territory that rightfully belonged to Russia, according to his own political dogma. The Ukraine war was meant to be an extension of Putin's strongman position, reinforcing him as the leader for life in Russia. Instead, Ukraine has whittled away at the image Putin has so carefully crafted. By crossing red lines, it's shown that Putin's bark is worse than his bite, which is a message that Europe and the US have taken on board. By staging such a solid defense against the far larger Russian forces, Ukraine has also demonstrated that Putin's military threat isn't as powerful as once thought. The Russian military is increasingly looking like a paper tiger, a military that looks strong on paper, but is far weaker when put to the test. With Ukraine's invasion of Kursk comes yet another chink in the strongman's armor. For so many years, Putin has positioned himself as the protector of the Russian people, a man who would ensure they came to no harm, even as he pushed aggressive policies externally. That image has been shattered. Thousands of Russians are being evacuated, and Ukraine is driving deeper into his country. Even if Russia manages to push Ukraine out of Kursk, Putin faces a political future in which doubt can be cast on his leadership. That doubt is the enemy of the authoritarian leader, and it could slowly lead to Russia's people losing confidence in Putin. He isn't helping himself. As The Guardian pointed out in an article on August 13th, Putin easily won Russia's presidential elections in March 2000 and has held on to power with an iron grip ever since. But it's now over 24 years later, and Russia finds itself staring down the barrel of a gun that represents so many of the problems it faced when Putin first took power. There is war, just as there was in September 1999, when Russia was bombing the Chechen capital of Grozny. Only now, the war is on a grander scale, and Russia is finding itself fighting on its own territory for the first time since World War II. As for Putin's response, it's been lackluster at best. At the time of the writing of this script, we're entering the 9th day of the Kursk invasion. Ukraine isn't being pushed back. If anything, it's gaining more territory, showcasing how poor Russia's defenses are. And the best Putin can muster is a promise to provide a 10,000 ruble handout to those who are affected. That amounts to $109, a pittance for people who are now facing losing their homes. A strong man has been brought to his knees by the Kursk invasion. Only time will tell if he is able to get back up, or if Ukraine's invasion of Kursk truly stands as a pivotal moment in Putin's presidency. With that, we turn the questions over to you. What do you think the situation in Kursk means for the Ukraine war and Putin's future? Will Ukraine launch further invasions on the back of this success, and is it possible that Putin will be forced to the negotiating table in the wake of these events? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Ukraine's forces have achieved the unthinkable. They've crossed the Russian border, launching a surprise invasion that left Moscow reeling. The question now echoing in the Kremlin and around the world is, how did this happen? How could Russia, with all its might, have failed in its most fundamental task, preventing an invasion on its own soil? As of this script's writing, Russia's so-called special military operation to reclaim Ukrainian land has turned into a nightmare. 900 days in, and it's Ukraine that's rewriting the rules of this conflict. Even if by the time you watch this video Ukraine has been pushed back across its border, the war has changed forever. But to understand Russia's catastrophic failure, we need to explore a critical factor that has ironically aided its collapse more than any Ukrainian offensive ever could: NATO's restraint. Throughout this conflict, the West and Putin have been locked in a tense game of cat and mouse. The West has cautiously escalated its involvement, delivering increasingly capable weapons to Ukraine. Each time, Putin responded with his usual threat to unleash nuclear devastation, and each time, the West hesitated. The debates over sending modern tanks raged for over a year, until Britain finally said, "Hold my tea," and broke the deadlock by sending a few Challenger tanks to Ukraine. Yet despite these breakthroughs, the top-tier equipment came with strings attached. In a bid to avoid provoking Putin's wrath, Western powers imposed heavy restrictions. Weapons couldn't be provided to Russian rebel forces. Ukraine was initially forbidden from launching strikes into Crimea, and any cross-border attacks by Ukrainian forces were strictly off-limits. This was a severe handicap for Ukraine, as Russia exploited its ability to launch attacks from behind the safety of its border, where it was shielded from Ukrainian retaliation. To grasp the absurdity of this situation, picture a boxing match. Ukraine is up against an opponent with a much longer reach, Russia, but Ukraine is forbidden from getting close enough to land a punch, while Russia is free to jab at will. It's not hard to see how this fight could end. Then this past summer, the stakes rose dramatically. Russia began massing troops and equipment just across the border from Kyiv, preparing for a massive offensive. Ukrainian intelligence had warned of a looming assault, but the exact location remained a mystery until the shelling began. With 50,000 troops poised to strike, Ukraine found itself in a desperate situation. But in a surprising turn, President Biden authorized Ukraine to use American long-range munitions to disrupt the Russian advance. For the first time in the war, Ukraine was allowed to strike Russian forces on their own soil. HIMARS rockets, both GMLRS and ATACMS, rained down on Russian troop concentrations, vehicles and equipment, crippling the Kharkiv offensive. In one strike, Ukraine unleashed over 120 precision rockets, shattering Russian forces on their side of the border. President Biden had given authorization for American weapons to be used in a limited fashion inside of Russian territory, responding to Russian attacks or within a certain distance from the border. This still placed the vast majority of Russian high-value targets, such as airfields, out of reach, but it ensured that Russia could not mass forces on its side of the border without being harassed ever again. But nobody could have guessed how the paradigm would radically shift once again just 2 months later. Even after suffering a defeat in the Kharkiv offensive and taking significant casualties in cross-border missile and rocket attacks, Russia still believed that the old paradigm was still in play. NATO would never dare authorize Ukrainian military action into Russia itself, aside from the use of long-range munitions. After all, Putin had spent 2 years at this point rolling out the old nuclear saber and rattling it, making sure the West would self-deter as much as possible. This brings us to the situation on the Kursk border with Ukraine right before the UAF invasion. To say that Russia has fought this war in extreme luxury would be an understatement. Despite Putin's propaganda that NATO poses an existential threat to Russia, it's not stopped him from stripping troops and equipment from all of his shared borders with NATO countries. Even the Kaliningrad exclave has seen massive drawdowns for service in Ukraine. This is because despite the rhetoric, Putin knows that NATO does not and never did want a military confrontation with Russia. Thus, he's free to leave nothing more than a token force on his borders with NATO. This same understanding stretched to Ukraine. While Russian targets in Ukraine were finally free game for the UAF, Putin's fundamental understanding of the rules of this conflict was that Ukraine would never dare invade Russian territory, and especially not with NATO equipment. Sure, small cross-border raids by separatist groups were an ongoing concern, but these raids were easily rebuffed after only a few days and inflicted barely any political or military cost on the Kremlin. Thus, Russia has historically only secured its border with Ukraine with forces large enough to deter small-scale raids and respond to an eventual skirmish, but not large enough to stop a conventional force looking to seize and hold Russian territory. FSB border security troops and conscripts make up the bulk of Russian border forces and are spread thin as is, far thinner than would be the case in a normal war between two neighboring nations. If this were a normal war, Russia would maintain large garrisons all across its border with Ukraine, along with picket forces meant to detect an invasion attempt that the nearest garrison force would then immediately respond to. Ukraine lacks the manpower to require a full-scale defense of the border, but even this economic strategy would still require tens of thousands of soldiers given the several hundred miles of border between the two nations that's still controlled by Ukraine. However, because Ukraine's hands are tied by its Western partners, Russia doesn't have to secure its border, even with this greatly reduced force level. It's instead free to send those tens of thousands of soldiers and all of their supporting equipment into the front lines inside Ukraine itself, leaving its border secured with far less well-equipped and trained paramilitary forces and conscripts. This has helped put considerable strain on the Ukrainian defenders, who still have to maintain their own border security forces out of fear Russia could quickly assemble an invasion force on its side of the border with little to no notice. And unlike their Russian counterparts, these border forces need to have armored vehicles and air defense systems, or else Ukraine could suffer a catastrophic flanking attack that could threaten to collapse the front. It's easy to see where this is going. Early in August, Ukraine exploited this complacency to stunning success. The second point of failure in Russia's defense of its border came from ignoring reports by its border troops. FSB border troops and their conscript augmentees began reporting unusual Ukrainian activity in late July, growing in concern as they believed that possibly a major raid was going to take place. We likely won't know the real answer until well after this war is concluded and the archives unsealed, but it's likely that Russia ignored these reports out of, again, its sense of complacency. If Ukraine was massing troops on the border, then it was just a ploy to get them to redeploy forces from the front in the east, where Russia was and continues to make incremental gains. However, this being Russia and the full scope of its incompetency now known to outside observers, it's also just as likely that these reports never made it up the chain of command. And if they did, then they weren't shared with the rest of the Russian defense apparatus. Russia lacks a unified chain of command between the FSB, its National Guard, and the regular military, and there's no telling where a point of failure could have occurred, but the opportunities are plentiful. What's clear is that Russia's deep complacency extended even to carrying out surveillance of its wartime border. The Ukrainian invasion went off without a hitch, kept in absolute secrecy until the very last minute, a testament to Ukraine's ability to maintain strong operational security. However, there's simply no excuse for Russia to not have been conducting aggressive surveillance of its border at all times. Russian patrols equipped with surveillance drones should have been sufficient to detect the buildup of forces and raise the alarm. The third point of failure is Russia's unprepared physical defenses. Ukraine took a lot of heat in the Kyiv direction when it was discovered that despite the threat of Russian invasion, local commanders had not strongly fortified against a Russian assault. Yet the difference between the Ukrainian defenses north of Kyiv and Russia's border defenses is significant. Best reporting states that the Russians had set up as much as 2 lines of trenches, but these were very sparingly manned. There were defensive fortifications where Ukrainians met stiff resistance, but upon making contact, the Ukrainian invasion force simply drove past them. Cut off from the rear, defenders were forced to flee, surrender, or put up a doomed last stand. This is best exemplified by the performance of Chechen fighters on the border. There were elements of the Chechen 141st Special Motorized Regiment, also known as Kadyrivets for their loyalty to Chechen's head Ramzan Kadyrov. Another moniker they go by is Akhmat Special Forces, and they have a fierce reputation, feared even by Russian troops as some of the best, most aggressive fighters in the entire Russian armed forces. At least up until February 24th of 2022. When faced with real combat, these TikTok warriors were soon discovered to break and run more often than not. They repeated this performance in the Kursk Oblast, where dozens of Chechens were captured with Ukraine showing off their documentation as proof, while the commander of local Akhmat forces fled to the safety of the rear. In a TikTok video, he claimed that the reason Akhmat had failed to defend the border is that Ukrainians simply drove past them. Captured Chechen travel documents would say otherwise. The failures to coordinate a defense are not just due to physical deficiencies though, but also critical failures in planning, strategy, and command and control. First, Russia failed to create a realistic defensive plan in case of incursion. Faced with the prospect of defending such a long border with limited troops, Russia would have been better served by creating pickets along the border. Every dozen miles or so and several miles behind the border, rapid response forces armed with drones, armored vehicles, and man-portable air defenses should have been stationed. Upon contact, picket forces would have been instructed to report the attack and break contact, trading very low military value territory for time. Rapid response forces would then be assembled from all neighboring encampments, assembled into a combined force, and sent to counterattack. The combined response force could then fight a delaying action if facing a significantly more powerful enemy, or deliver a counterattack to push invaders back across the border. In the meantime, response forces from encampments further away would have time to assemble, delivering augmentation forces to the front within 24 to 48 hours. This strategy would have served Russia's limited manpower pool very well, given that it would have been possible to fully man the border with multiple defensive lines all fully staffed. However, there's a plethora of reasons it was beyond the reach of Russia. The first is the fact that Russia's current border and regional forces do not share a joint chain of command. This is hardly new, as even inside Ukraine the regular Russian army struggles to perform joint operations between its branches, sometimes even between larger Russian units. Combined arms operations continue to be out of reach of Russia, and especially so in its poorly defended border. With a combination of conscripts and other forces, local commanders found themselves at odds with each other over how to react to the Ukrainian invasion, and the problem persists even a week after it began. Currently, Russia is planning its counterattack to contain the UAF, but this plan is being met with extreme skepticism. The most obvious problem comes from the composition of the forces assigned to Kursk, currently the Russian National Guard, Russian FSB Border Guard Service, Interior Ministry troops, conscripts from the regular army, PMCs, and other irregular forces have all been tapped for the response. All of these share completely independent command structures, and there exists no joint command structure between them. As usual, Russia is having to make it up as it goes along due to a lack of planning, and given their troubles with regular army forces in Ukraine, there's little reason to believe that a Russian response to Ukraine's invasion is going to be well coordinated or particularly effective. Particularly effective does not mean fruitless though. Russia still has a lot of manpower it's willing to send into the meat grinder. Compared to Ukrainian forces though, who by all accounts are made up of hardened combat veterans and experienced commanders, the Russian response is unlikely to be an efficient one. This time though, Russia may not be able to meat grinder its way to victory for one very specific reason. As the Ukrainians invaded Kursk, Russian units were either taken so by surprise, overwhelmed by the violence and speed of the assault, or destroyed in fighting. By and large, the UAF was going up against conscripts, whom by Russian law cannot be used as expeditionary forces outside of Russian borders. This hasn't stopped some numbers of conscripts from ending up in Ukraine, but even Putin has been extremely sensitive to the mass use of conscripts in combat. Shortly after the invasion, he personally met with mothers of conscripted soldiers who had accidentally been sent to Ukraine and has made efforts to prevent it from happening again. These conscripts are notoriously poorly trained and terribly equipped. Even in peacetime, they suffer from extreme levels of physical and sexual abuse, low morale, and very poor quality equipment and training. There's little indication that things have changed in wartime, and Russia's border conscripts have performed as expected, with the UAF taking hundreds of conscripts prisoner and inflicting a yet unverified but seemingly high level of casualties on the rest. Russian troops dying en masse in meat grinder battles of attrition is nothing new. What is new, this time, is that photos and videos of dead conscripts are making the rounds on social media, but they aren't dying in distant battlefields, they're dying on the front lawns of Russian homes. One infamous example is a HIMARS ambush of a Russian reinforcement convoy, with the convoy destroyed directly in front of a row of Russian homes. Visual estimates of the casualties count around 3 dozen dead. Ukraine states that as of the writing of this script at the end of the first week of the invasion, it's taken 2,000 Russian prisoners of war. And there's little reason to doubt this figure is more or less correct, given the number of videos and photos shared via Telegram and other social media. In these videos, we can see Ukrainian forces detaining groups of up to 2 dozen at a time, with one video showing 30 individuals surrendering at once. Normally, it's prudent to be wary of media manipulation. This is a war after all, and social media is a powerful tool. But the depth of Ukrainian penetration into Russian territory and the wealth of evidence strongly hints that the Ukrainian figures are more correct than not. There's also mounting pressure from the Russian population itself concerning conscript deaths and capture. A movement meant to bring awareness to the killing and capture of conscripts quickly grew in popularity shortly after the start of the invasion, spearheaded by Russian mothers concerned for their own children conscripted into the military. Putin seems to be aware of the sensitivity of conscript deaths within the Russian population, an odd occurrence for a society with an extremely high threshold for pain in terms of regular war casualties. Ukraine may have been counting on this, with conscript deaths and captures feeding into its strategy. Many have wondered at the purpose of the invasion, with some criticizing it for taking troops away from a front where Ukraine is being steadily pushed back across many sections. Yet the death of Russian conscripted youth is already achieving an effect that scores of dead Russian contract soldiers isn't. The casualties are only likely to mount though, as reports are that only small amounts of forces are being pulled from the front as of the writing of this script. Instead, it seems like conscripts will play a role in the attempted retaking of Kursk, and the fact that the Kremlin seems to have no real plan does not bode well for these forces. It took 3 days for Putin to react to the Ukrainian invasion, a sure sign that nobody in this chain of command had a plan in place to deal with such an incursion. when Putin did respond, it was immediately clear that there still existed no plan for countering the invasion. The mixed nature of the planned response is indicative of how poorly prepared Russia was and continues to be. Please leave your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. It was a gamble unlike any that we've seen so far in the Ukraine war. On August 6th, Ukraine sent a small contingent of soldiers into the Russian region of Kursk. Early reports suggested that anywhere between 300 and 1,000 soldiers had crossed the border, having broken through the poorly defended Russian fortifications on the front lines to make the journey. Since then, Ukraine has kept pushing. Its soldiers continue to move through Kursk, with some even making their way to Belgorod, and the entire complexion of the Ukraine war has changed. For the first time, Russia is being forced to defend itself on its own territory, a situation that seemed unfathomable in February 2022, when the entire world was shaken by President Vladimir Putin and his special military operation. Ever since that Kursk invasion, there's been a key question circulating in the media and among Ukraine's allies. Why? Ukraine's capture of Russian territory in Kursk isn't so much about holding Russian land as it is about changing Russia's entire approach to the war. After all, it's forced Putin to pull troops out of vital areas in Ukraine to defend Russia, which is a situation that will only benefit Ukraine as the war takes its next dramatic turn. But before we get into Russia and Putin's decision to pull his units out of Ukraine, let's dig a little deeper into what's happening in Kursk right now. In an interview with the BBC on August 13th, a Ukrainian soldier named Tomasz explained some of what happened on August 6th. "We had orders to come here, but we didn't know what they meant," he said while drinking coffee at a gas station inside Kursk. Those orders were surprisingly simple. The evening of August 6th saw a small contingent of Ukrainian troops cross the border between Ukraine and Russia, entering the region of Kursk. Since then, the Ukrainians have advanced rapidly. Those early incursions saw it seize 28 settlements, as confirmed by Russia's Ministry of Defense, as well as the Sudza gas metering station. Owned by Gazprom, which is Russia's largest energy supplier, that station transmits Russian natural gas to the rest of Europe. It's a key part of the country's European energy infrastructure, and now it's under Ukrainian control. Though, as Gazprom itself claims, the emerging satellite imagery of damage to the station doesn't mean that Ukraine has destroyed it. Yet. "We suppressed the enemy's means of communication and surveillance in advance to clear the way," continued Tomasz, who remarked that the entire operation was far simpler than he would have thought. Those comments have been echoed in photos and video footage that have started emerging on the Telegram social media platform in the days since the initial invasion. One such video shows a soldier who claims that months of planning went into the operation, with its goal being to force Russia to move troops to other parts of the front lines. "The element of surprise worked," claims the soldier in the clip. "We entered easily, with little resistance. On August 6th, the first groups crossed at night in several directions. Russia's poorly manned defenses on the border couldn't stop these initial groups. What followed was nothing short of a remarkable Ukrainian advancement into Russian territory. That initial group of 1,000 is now believed to be growing in number, though reports are starting to conflict one another." On August 13th, the BBC noted that Ukraine's President Zelensky is now claiming that Ukraine holds 74 settlements in Kursk. Russia's defense ministry hasn't commented since its initial confirmation that 28 settlements had been overrun, meaning there's little reason to doubt Ukraine's claims. Whatever the case may be, it doesn't change the fact that Ukraine now controls villages and towns inside Russian territory. It's a sharp humiliation for Putin that also changes the entire complexion of the war. Ukraine is also claiming that it now controls about 386 square miles of Russian territory in Kursk, though the BBC says that is a disputed claim. The Institute for the Study of War, for example, says that while Ukrainian soldiers may be spread out that far, it's unlikely that the entire region is under the Ukrainian army's complete control. What is more certain is that Russian civilians are fleeing Kursk in droves. The BBC says that 121,000 have left their homes so far, many on their way to Moscow, to escape the war that's coming to their doorstep. A further 180,000 have been told they need to leave, meaning Ukraine's invasion has forced the temporary displacement of nearly 200,000 Russian civilians in the space of a week. Moscow is preparing to welcome as many of those people as possible, having set up 400 shelters across the country that will serve as makeshift homes for up to 30,000 evacuees. But it's clear that the scale of the escape from Kursk is growing beyond Moscow's control. It barely has enough shelters to handle a sixth of the people who've been displaced so far. All of this implies that the Kursk offensive has been extremely successful so far. But that success doesn't answer the question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why did Ukraine choose to launch its invasion now?
It's not about taking territory, at least according to Ukraine's foreign ministry. On the afternoon of August 13th, a claim came out that Ukraine was not interested in taking territory, with the supposed goal being broader than that. A spokesperson for the ministry said, "The sooner Russia agrees to restore a just peace, the sooner Ukrainian raids on Russian territory will stop. As long as Putin continues the war, he will receive such responses from Ukraine." So the Kursk invasion is actually about bringing an end to the entire war then? Perhaps it is, in part, but there's a far more immediate and practical reason for Zelensky taking such a massive gamble. Ukrainian troops invading Kursk will force Russia to deploy soldiers it has stationed elsewhere to deal with them, and that action will have a far greater impact on the war than many realize. We're already seeing this happen. On August 13th, a week after the Kursk invasion began, Politico ran an article in which it reported on the comments of Ukrainian army spokesperson Dmytro Likovy. He claimed that the invasion had left Moscow scrambling, forcing Putin to not only express anger, but claim that the West was responsible for the invasion. The Russian president claims that Russia will mount a worthy response to Ukraine's actions, with that response appearing to be pulling troops out of other locations to send to Kursk. Russia has relocated some of its units from both the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions of Ukraine's south, Likovy claims. This move is notable because those regions were among the first that Russia attacked when Putin launched his special military operation in February 2022. Kherson in particular was a major early victory for Russia. Symbolically, it was the first major Ukrainian city to fall to the Russian invasion, allowing Putin to proclaim an early victory in his operation. But perhaps more important is Kherson's location. With a population of 380,000 people, Kherson lies on the banks of the Dnipro River, giving Russia key access to the city via the Black Sea. In the early days of the war, this access was seen as vital. Russia's dreaded Black Sea Fleet will be able to send soldiers and supplies into Kherson via Crimea, allowing Putin to reinforce his armies in South Ukraine. Of course, we now know that the war hasn't played out quite like that, with Ukraine managing to use missiles and drone strikes to take out a third of the Black Sea Fleet. That part of the fleet wasn't rendered completely useless, but Russia is far warier about using it now than it was when it first took Kherson. Still, this proximity to Crimea is important to both sides. For Russia, it's due to the logistical advantages, and for Ukraine, because Kherson acts as a sort of gateway to the annexed territory. Crimea has been under Russian control since 2014, with taking back Crimea likely being a key objective for Ukraine in the war. Kherson is important in that, as Dr. Marina Miron, who researches defense studies at the King's College London, explains, recapturing it would pave the way to reconquering Crimea, which Ukraine aims to do in this war. Back to the city's importance, Kherson offers access to the Dnipro River, a waterway that runs right into the center of Ukraine. Again, that river could serve as a major supply line for Russia as it advances closer to Kyiv from the south. Why does any of this matter in the context of Kursk? Russia removing troops from Kherson means that it's prioritizing the protection of its own territory over the retaking of important territory in Ukraine. It weakens the assaults Russia can carry out on a key Ukrainian city, and one that Russia controlled in the early months of the war, allowing Ukraine to refortify Kherson so it becomes much harder for Russia to retake once it's resolved the Kursk issue. However, it's unknown just how many troops Russia has redeployed. Likovy suggests that Russia has moved a relatively small number of soldiers from Kherson to Kursk, meaning there will still be Russian forces in the city. That could be a miscalculation by Putin. Though Ukraine invaded Kursk with a small number of soldiers itself, as around 1,000 crossed the border, those soldiers have succeeded by creating anarchy in the oblast. Roving units are destroying Russian defenses at small settlements, followed by larger units of Ukrainian troops that secure those settlements and fortify them. A relatively small number of Russian soldiers isn't likely to be able to dislodge the Ukrainian soldiers from their positions quickly. Plus, now that Ukraine has broken through to Kursk, nothing is stopping it from reinforcing those positions it's taken with soldiers of its own. In short, the Kursk invasion has forced Putin into a change of tactics. However, it may not have forced the change that Ukraine wanted. While troops moving out of Kherson is important, Ukraine would have preferred Russia to move soldiers away from the Donetsk region. Al Jazeera said as much in a video published on August 12th, in which it claimed that the invasions of Kursk and Belgorod were intended to change the dynamics in Donetsk by forcing Russia to send troops from that region. That would relieve some pressure on Ukrainian forces stationed in and around that city, which have faced constant bombardment as Russia attempts to secure more territory in the Donbass. But Donetsk remains in Russia's focus. Back in February 2024, Reuters reported that Russia was firing anywhere between 1,500 and 2,500 rockets and artillery shells at the war-torn city daily, with its goal being to take out key infrastructure before winter in hopes of forcing more of the city's population out by the end of the year. Ukraine is trying to hold Russia back in the eastern province. Russia currently holds about 57% of Donetsk, but the constant pressure has been telling. Ukraine wanted to ease that pressure. However, Putin's response of pulling soldiers out of Kherson suggests that won't happen. As Politico points out, Russia has instead tried to counter Ukraine's gains by launching refreshed offensives in Pokrovsk, which is in the Donetsk region, alongside other locations in Donetsk. For now, Russia seems satisfied with pulling troops out of Kherson, along with sending troops from Kaliningrad into Kursk. That's according to Laurynas Kasčiūnas, the Lithuanian defense minister, who claims that Lithuania has spotted Russian troops leaving Kaliningrad in the wake of the Kursk invasion. All of this adds up to a fairly confused response on the part of Russia. Lakovi said as much when speaking to Ukrainian TV, noting that Russia launched several attacks on Kherson, even as it withdrew some of its forces to send to Kursk. "We must still understand whether it's a smokescreen activity," he noted. But trying to create a smokescreen could backfire on Putin. If the army is only diverting small numbers of troops to tackle the Kursk problem, with the focus remaining on the Donetsk and Kherson regions, Russia may find itself losing even more territory. A small contingent isn't going to stop Ukraine's advance, especially given how meager the Russian defenses were initially. Those small numbers of troops will run into far stronger Ukrainian fortifications, as well as having to deal with the potential for Ukraine to send more soldiers into Kursk, so these former Kherson units are attacked from both sides. Only one thing is certain: Putin has been forced to change his approach to the Ukraine war. For the first time since the war began, he's not fighting on his own terms. Instead, he's having to respond to a successful Ukrainian offensive that has brought the war into Russia. Regardless of the nature of his response, this is something that Putin neither anticipated nor prepared for, meaning that he's been humiliated as Ukraine shows he hasn't done enough to defend the Russian people. Let's focus back on Kherson for a bit. Though the removal of troops from that pivotal city may seem like a huge bond for Ukraine, the reality is that Russia had already done something similar back in November 2022. Several months after taking Kherson, Putin ordered the withdrawal of many of his soldiers stationed in the city as they stared down a Ukrainian counterattack that they likely wouldn't be able to handle. Ukraine successfully liberated the city 9 months after it was taken. However, Kherson was far from a secure area following this liberation. As AP News reported, in November 2022, the departing Russian forces littered the city's streets with landmines that one Ukrainian official noted could render Kherson a city of death. Mikhailo Podolyak made those claims, and another that would turn out to be prescient. Russia would start shelling Kherson intensely after it relocated its troops to the other side of the Dnipro River. That's exactly what happened. As CNN reported in February 2024, the successful liberation of Kherson by Ukraine didn't result in the city becoming a safe haven for its people or a location from which Ukraine could organize attacks against Russian positions in the south. The shelling that Podolyak predicted soon came, with residents describing the level of drones and artillery pounding away at the city to be at the worst levels they'd seen since the beginning of the war. The Dnipro riverside is now lined with trenches, and the endless storm of artillery has left Kherson a broken husk, where broken glass and destroyed buildings line the streets. Pessimism has reigned in Kherson for 2 years. CNN reports that repair workers have taken to making dark jokes, with one saying his team celebrated the 10,000th window they'd boarded up in the wake of the Russian attacks. Kherson may not have become the city of death that Podolyak envisioned in terms of Russian landmines, but Russia has spent almost the entire war ensuring that the city would have no chance of recovery following its forced withdrawal in November 2022. All of which brings us back to the Kursk invasion. Perhaps now we're starting to see more of Ukraine's strategy crystallizing. Zelensky made a huge gamble when he okayed the Kursk invasion. He bet that Russia would be able to do little to stop his soldiers from entering Russian territory and, crucially, that he wouldn't face any blowback from the West for taking the war into Russian territory. The gamble paid off. Ukraine is in Russia, and the West isn't telling Zelensky that his soldiers need to leave. The success of that gamble has forced Putin to rethink his strategy. That's evident in the troop diversions we've spoken of. Russia is weakening its position in Kherson to send troops into Kursk. That's ideal for Zelensky, as Ukraine only intends to hold Russian territory for as long as is needed to achieve its own aims. With Russian soldiers leaving Kherson, perhaps now could be a time for Ukraine to consolidate its position in that city properly and prepare to defend it against future Russian attacks. There's also the Donetsk region to consider. Yes, Zelensky would have liked to see Russian soldiers diverted from that region in response to the Kursk invasion, but that hasn't happened. Yet. Given that we don't know just how many soldiers Putin is sending to Kursk, it's still very possible that Ukraine could fend off the initial Russian response, forcing Russia to divert troops from elsewhere. If Zelensky's luck holds out, that elsewhere could be Donetsk, which would again afford Ukraine time to not only refortify, but to potentially launch counterattacks against weakened Russian forces. But Ukraine may have had other goals with the Kursk invasion. Disrupting Russian logistics could be one of them. As part of the newest invasion, Ukraine has seized a key Russian gas transmission station. It's also taking territory through which Russia might have sent reinforcements into Donetsk. Now around 200,000 people are being evacuated from Kursk, with the region becoming far less useful to Putin. As the Kyiv Independent points out, the incursion could also halt cross-border attacks from Kursk, allowing Ukrainian soldiers to not only regroup but also redeploy closer to Donetsk to shore up Ukraine's defenses. That means two more goals may have been achieved. Even if Russian soldiers aren't pulled from Donetsk, Ukraine has made it much more difficult for Russia to send reinforcements into the region. And with Russia now trying to retake Kursk, rather than fight Ukraine on its own territory in the north, Ukraine can send more soldiers to Donetsk. If nothing else, the invasion has forced a stretching of the front lines. That's according to ABC News, which wrote that Zelensky's decision to invade Kursk was a bold gamble, given that he was encroaching on the territory of a nuclear-armed country. A country that's made multiple threats to use tactical nukes in Ukraine. Those threats haven't come to fruition, with Putin only able to muster a meager response to the Ukrainian incursion. Evacuations and troop diversions, rather than a nuclear holocaust, have been the results. That's yet another way that Zelensky's big gamble has paid off. It's shown that crossing the final red line and invading Russia doesn't come with the repercussions that Putin claimed it would. Whatever happens in Kursk from this point forth, Ukraine has achieved a symbolic victory against Putin. It's demonstrated that there is a far lighter bite behind the Russian president's nuclear barking, which opens the door for future incursions into Russian territory. It also shows the rest of Europe that Ukraine is still worth backing in this war, and that Russia may not present the level of threat many believed it did in the past. A chink in Putin's armor has been revealed, with the strongman of Russian politics being shown as somebody who doesn't always back up his word. That's not the only chink that Zelensky's gamble revealed. The mere fact that Ukraine was able to launch the Kursk invasion in the first place shows the strategic weakness of the Russian approach to the war. So focused was Putin on achieving his objectives in Donetsk that he failed to secure the front lines in North Ukraine. Arrogance may have played a part here. Putin likely didn't anticipate that Ukraine would even consider an invasion into Kursk or any other Russian territory, leading him to dedicating just enough to the northern front lines to occupy Ukraine in its own territory. That approach has clearly backfired. With Ukrainian forces now in Kursk, the war's front lines have been expanded and stretched, with the result being what we're currently seeing. Russia is having to weaken its positions elsewhere to handle the Kursk problem. Of course, there's a wrinkle to this strategy. Stretching the front lines has just as much of an impact on Ukraine as it does on Russia. Ukraine's commander of the 14th Regiment of Unmanned Drones, identified only through his code name of Charlie by ABC, says as much. The stretching of the front line for us is also stretching the front line for the enemy, he claims. Only we have prepared for this operation in detail. The Russians were not prepared for this operation at all. In other words, Ukraine has accounted for the impact the stretching of the front lines will have. A metaphorical stacking of the deck in Zelensky's big gamble, resulting in the front line expansion working out in Ukraine's favor. There's another way that Zelensky's big gamble has proven to be a strategic masterstroke. It's resulted in the capture of several hundred Russian conscripts, many of whom were only recently installed in Putin's army. That's according to the live tracker Sky News has put in place following the initial Kursk invasion. On August 15th, it reported on claims from Zelensky that Ukraine had captured around 100 Russian prisoners of war during the previous 24 hours, with many dozens more having been caught between August 6th and 13th. That represents a more literal weakening of Russia's front line, as those are soldiers who will no longer be able to fight against Ukraine. Russia will have to replace those captured conscripts, which creates another explanation on why it's diverting troops away from Kherson and other regions to send to Kursk. Finally, there's the major propaganda victory Ukraine has achieved as a result of its Kursk invasion. On August 15th, Sky News published a report on the captured Russians, in which its reporters actually spoke to some of those who'd been captured. It described the detainees as generally being young conscripts, many aged between 19 and 21, who had absolutely no idea how to respond when Ukraine invaded. The men, who were unnamed and now shown in pictures, said that Ukraine's attack happened extremely quickly and they simply surrendered rather than fighting back. They claimed their families had no idea what had happened to them, with some expressing hope that their capture would lead to a prisoner exchange at some point. That's damaging to Putin in several ways. As Sky News points out, he said at several points during the war that conscripts wouldn't be sent near the front lines until they were more experienced. These captures refute that claim. Most people to whom Sky News spoke were young men recently conscripted and placed in vulnerable positions. Not only does this make Putin look like a liar, but it exposes weaknesses in his army. Are Russia's manpower issues so severe that it's being forced to use barely trained conscripts as the first line of defense against Ukrainian forces? The Kursk invasion would certainly suggest so. Worse yet for Putin, his reputation as a strongman has been damaged. That's according to Sky News security and defense editor Deborah Haynes, who says that it's become impossible for Putin to hide this invasion from the Russian people. For a politician, a former spy, who has spent his career building a reputation of being a strongman, to have his country invaded in this way, it must be a huge blow to President Putin. All of this leads us to a final question. What happens next? That question is difficult to answer. The odds seem high that Ukraine is going to fortify its positions in Kursk, ready to fight against the troops that Putin is diverting from Kherson. That fortification could result in more Russian losses, leading to more troop diversions. The longer Ukraine can hold the 74 settlements it's taken in Kursk, the more time it gives itself to take advantage of the stretching of the front lines. That could open the door for more counter-offensives in Donetsk, assuming Putin is forced to divert troops from this critical region, as well as the fortification of Kursk and the countering of artillery strikes that have battered the city for so long. All that being said, Kursk wasn't the objective. It was a gamble played to perfection by Zelensky that's completely changed the layout of the war. Putin is now being forced to respond while facing the humiliation of being the first Russian leader since World War II to allow another country to invade Russian territory. In the end, the damage the Kursk invasion has caused to Putin may be just as valuable as the forcing of troops to relocate. But what do you think? What are the long-term ramifications of Ukraine's invasion of Kursk, and what do you make of Putin's response so far? Could the stretching of the front line open up opportunities elsewhere? Share your opinions in the comments below, and thank you for watching this video. Now go and check out the shocking results of Ukraine's invasion into Russia, or click this other video instead. In a move that has shocked the world, Ukraine has just launched a daring invasion into Russia, flipping the script on a war that many thought they understood. But this assault didn't come out of nowhere. For months, Ukraine has been meticulously setting the stage with a series of calculated strikes deep into Russian territory. These weren't random attacks, they were precision strikes, each one part of a master plan. With every hit, Ukraine was not only probing Russia's defenses, but also exposing Putin's vulnerabilities for the world to see. These strikes revealed the cracks in Russia's armor, and now, as the world watches in awe, Ukraine's true strategy is revealed. A meticulously crafted plan to strike Russia where it hurts most. Ukrainians consider that Russia did not invade their country in 2022, but nearly 10 years earlier, in 2014, when Russian special forces, the so-called Little Green Men, occupied Crimea and annexed it at the bidding of Russian President Vladimir Putin. At the same time, Russian-armed and Russian-backed separatists, supported by elements of the Russian army and Russian special forces, also occupied parts of the Donetsk and Donbass regions in eastern Ukraine. A protracted low-intensity conflict began. In February 2022, the Russian army launched a full-scale conventional attack into the rest of Ukraine, aiming at capturing Kyiv, the capital, and decapitating the government. After initial advances, the Russian army was halted amid extremely high numbers of casualties, thousands of troops, armored vehicles, and combat aircraft. The Russian military's inability to conduct rudimentary battlefield tactics, let alone undertake more complex combined arms operations, was exposed. After years of poor investment and corruption, the Russian army was exposed as a hollow shell. Vladimir Putin's three-day special military operation, intended to take Kyiv and bring down the democratically elected Ukrainian government in a lightning strike, is now in its third year. The Russian advance slowed to a crawl and was even forced back in some areas, and then it came to a halt. Artillery barrages have turned woods and forests into splintered wastelands, highly reminiscent of Western France during the First World War. Tank and mechanized infantry forces slug it out. Russian infantry advance hesitantly across no man's land to be targeted by swarms of small drones mounting grenades and RPG rounds. But a stalemate does not win a war. Russia's sheer size, its factory capacity, and its manpower helps to compensate for its high losses. Despite Russia's willingness to expend thousands of its own soldiers in fruitless, suicidal attacks, a long drawn-out war may be working in its favor. The Russian army is slowly beginning to reconstitute itself in ways that the Ukrainian army, with fewer resources and personnel, is struggling to do. In a few weeks, a new Russian spring offensive looks likely. There are some major challenges facing Ukraine as it contemplates a new Russian attack. Artillery shells are running out, soldiers are running out, and much-needed support from international allies seems to be dwindling. Ukraine has gratefully received the M1 Abrams tank and the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles sent by America and a host of other equipment donated by the West, but the numbers are still relatively low. Some critical systems, such as the F-16, have still yet to make it into battle space, despite the conflict being over 2 years old.
is time running out for Ukraine? Last year, there were very high expectations for a Ukrainian counteroffensive once the Ukrainian military had absorbed new Western tanks, artillery, and armored fighting vehicles. But these hopes came to nothing. Artillery, missiles, battlefield drones, trenches, and mines have made the battlefield a harsh and extremely unforgiving environment for either side. Ukrainian mobile forces suffered almost as badly as the Russians. A breakthrough to the coast did not become a reality, and the front lines resumed their static character. But there are still some causes for optimism. The Ukrainian government and military are constantly looking at the best ways to maximize the resources they have, with the emphasis on creativity and initiative as they search for new approaches to defeat the enemy. We'd like to highlight a couple of areas that the Ukrainians are trying to exploit in order to take the war to the Russians, to disrupt their planning and their warfighting capability. Let's talk about the Ukrainian use of long-range drones and the indirect approach to warfare. Since the arrival of air power in the First World War, military commanders have been looking for ways to reach out beyond the front line and into enemy territory to stop enemy men, equipment, and other resources from getting to the battlefield. Far better to stop the guns and render tanks ineffective before they reach the war zone, rather than have to expend men and materiel destroying them after they've arrived, right? There are some good examples from the Second World War. The Battle of the Atlantic was an attempt by German submarines to intercept and sink the thousands of tons of troops, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and food supplies that were coming from America and Canada in order to support Britain and the war effort in Europe. This was a battle of supplies and logistics. Every aircraft in the hold of an Allied merchant ship that the Germans could sink was one less that would be dropping bombs on Hitler's Reich. Faced with the prospect of the severing of Britain's vital transatlantic supply line, British war leader Winston Churchill was reported to have said that the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Similarly, between 1942 and 44, the American Strategic Bombing Force launched raids against the Romanian Ploiești oil refineries in an effort to hamper the delivery of fuel for Germany's industry, aircraft, and panzer forces. Beyond the hedgerows of Normandy after D-Day, Allied aircraft roamed far behind German lines, swooping down on trains, railways, supply dumps, and communication centers. With the bogged-down battlefield in Ukraine, perhaps some of these lessons from history could be turned to Ukraine's favor. Battlefield drones have been around for a long time now. The US military was using surveillance and strike drones, or unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at the early part of the century. Since then, the use of drones has rapidly expanded, from small, lightweight drones that can carry a grenade to drop into a trench, through to larger systems that can travel hundreds of miles and carry a heavy payload. When Russia's conventional attack struck Ukraine in February 2022, both sides had a range of commercial and military drones at their disposal, some dating back to the Soviet era. One of the newer military drones particularly popular with the Ukrainian military is the Turkish TB2 Bayraktar. With a range of around 300 kilometers, it was Ukraine's only purpose-designed armed UAV. The Bayraktar had proven itself already in recent conflicts in Syria and in Azerbaijan. It can fly continuously for 27 hours and carry 4 laser-guided weapons. The Bayraktar was to become so well received based on its ability to destroy Russian armor that a pop song about it was written in Ukrainian, and there are even reports that children and family pets were named after it. With the critical conditions of war acting as an incentive, Ukrainian drone designers have taken this initial capability several steps further. Much of their early design and development work was amateur and improvised, manufactured at small scale in a basement or a workshop. They were often based on commercial quadcopters that could be bought in a hobby shop or online, or from off-the-shelf systems from China. As Russian bombs and missiles indiscriminately pounded civilian targets and urban areas across Ukraine, Ukrainian military planners were starting to look beyond the immediate front line and consider other ways of taking the war to Russia and disrupting the Russian war effort. With necessity being the mother of invention, Ukrainian forces were soon able to increase their drone attack capabilities and numbers. But Ukraine has been operating under political and humanitarian constraints that are not faced by Russia. The Ukrainian government has been at pains to avoid indiscriminate targeting of civilian sites. Furthermore, Western countries backing Ukraine and providing weapons, equipment, vehicles, and ammunition have been concerned that the weapon systems they provide should not be used to take the war into Russia. This is why specific long-range NATO missile systems, artillery pieces, and combat aircraft have either been slow to arrive or have still not yet been made available to the Ukrainian military. This has meant that the long-range drones that Ukraine can produce and operate themselves with fewer restrictions have taken on a higher prominence in the war. In early 2024, Ukrainian commander Major General Vadim Skibitsky was absolutely clear why the long-range drone campaign was critical to the Ukrainian way of waging war. He said that Ukraine had no choice. He said that victory on the battlefield was no longer possible in the face of Russian military superiority and the Ukrainian deficiencies in artillery shells and combat aircraft. It was essential instead to hit Russian targets beyond the front line, including infrastructure, command centers, and factories. So let's take a look at how the Ukrainian armed forces have been striking back and taking the war into Russia with aerial drones. Remember that it's not always easy to assess whether a particular explosion, fire, or incident is due to a drone. Both sides have been very cautious with information, and disinformation rules the airwaves. There have been many explosive incidents a few kilometers inside Russia. These are just as likely to be connected with artillery, airstrikes, sabotage, small arms fire, or other methods of attacks than they are linked to drones. However, as we get further away from the border and deeper into Russia, it's easier to see the work of drones. On the 22nd of June 2022, the first reports of a possible drone attack in Russia came in. An explosion at the oil refinery at Novoshakinsk was attributed to a suicide drone. The refinery was around 150 kilometers from the front line and was believed to have been struck by a Mugin 5 drone, which according to the company website, the commercial version is made of lightweight carbon fiber, has a flight time of 7 hours and can carry a payload of 25 kilograms. Because the earlier drones that were available to the Ukrainian military could only carry relatively light payloads, the planners and the drone operators had to put a high premium on good reconnaissance and intelligence for each mission. It was crucial to understand where the weakest link was in a large target such as a refinery, for example a crucial generator, in order to take it offline with a small but precise strike. Drone attacks were certainly not going to resemble the British and American saturation bombing raids of late World War II. Other reports began to come in of explosions across Russia. On Friday evening of 19th of August, Russian media sources reported drone attacks across in Crimea, other Russian-held parts of Ukraine, and also in Russia, with Russian air defense systems very active. These attacks were still relatively close to Ukraine, but that was to change as the year wore on. Early December 2022, as Russian air and missile strikes were pounding the Ukrainian energy network in an effort to freeze the country, explosions rocked 3 Russian military air bases across western Russia at Kursk, Saratov, and Ryazan. Saratov, the most distant target, is over 700 kilometers away from Ukraine, and Ryazan Air Base, home of Russian heavy bomber aircraft, is only 180 kilometers from Moscow. Let's have a think about what sort of targets the drones were being used against and what sort of intentions the Ukrainian leadership had when they authorized such attacks. Inevitably and understandably, Ukrainian senior commanders are tight-lipped about their strategies and intentions, but a wide spread of Russian targets are being hit. Almost all of these are either directly military targets or are sites that closely support Russia's military operations, including air bases, oil refineries, drone factories, railways, ships and naval bases, and steel plants. From this we can see that Ukrainian intentions are to strike out beyond the enemy tanks and troops on the front line and hit the strategic assets that power the Russian war machine: air power, transportation, fuel and factories. But many of these drone strikes serve a dual role: to strike at the military, but also to serve as a propaganda victory and to boost the morale of the home front. On Wednesday, 3rd of May 2023, 2 explosions struck the Kremlin, Russia's symbolic heart of government, and the Moscow base of President Vladimir Putin. Grainy video footage captured the 2 small-scale incidents. It does seem likely that 2 drones were employed, but the debate still rages on, distorted by misinformation on both sides. US officials, better placed than you or I to judge the situation, quickly came to the conclusion that the Ukrainians were likely behind the attacks. Russia claimed to have defeated the attack and immediately accused the Ukrainians of trying to assassinate Putin. Ukrainian President Zelensky denied that the attack came from Ukraine, but the incident had a big psychological impact, coming as it did on the anniversary of the 9th of May Victory Parade, when the Russian army was planning to drive through Red Square in the center of Moscow and celebrate victory over Nazi Germany during the Second World War. The message was very clear: Russia is certainly not safe from attack, and that Ukrainian capability was growing by the day. The Ukrainian ability to project drones into Russia continued to evolve, making improvements in size, scale, and capacity. At least one senior Ukrainian commander was heard to boast that they can fly to Moscow and back. The 12-mile-long Russian-built Kerch Bridge, built between 2016 and 2020 after Russia illegally annexed Crimea, links Crimea to Russia. For Ukrainians, it's always been a provocative symbol of the Russian invasion. The bridge has been attacked 3 times since the invasion in February 2022, but not yet by drone. If the bridge could be destroyed, it would be a major propaganda victory for Ukraine and a major disruption to supplies coming into Crimea. Ukrainian intelligence officials have been dropping strong hints that a drone attack against the bridge might also be a course of action they're considering. One Ukrainian official reportedly declared that the bridge will be attacked in the first half of 2024, so we might not have to wait long before we find out. But this might simply be a clever deception operation to keep Russia guessing and forcing it to spread its defensive assets even more thinly and in all directions. In 2023, Ukrainian drone attacks surged. A BBC report in September showed that the strikes were increasing in frequency and range. President Zelensky was less secretive about the use of drones over Russian territory, describing them as an inevitable, natural, and absolutely fair process. The BBC study concluded that there had been over 190 drone attacks into Russia and Russian-held Crimea in 9 months. There has also been no let-up in 2024. In fact, there was something of a surge in drone attacks in the build-up to the Russian presidential election in March. CNN reported that a wave of 36 drones were launched to coincide with the last day of voting. On the 2nd of April, 2024, Ukrainian drones hit an oil refinery and a drone factory in a Russian industrial area some 1,300 kilometers away from Ukraine. But how effective have these attacks into Russia actually been? Well, we have seen how important the attacks can be for Ukrainian morale, and the drone attacks have certainly put the spotlight on the effectiveness, or otherwise, of Russian air defenses. Firstly, it has meant that Russian defenses have had to be recalled from frontline duty and positioned to protect strategic targets further back in Russia. Secondly, despite the Russian media claims, it seems highly likely that Russian homeland air defenses are performing extremely poorly. Russian strategic air defenses have had a poor reputation for decades. The younger viewers might need to Google this gentleman, Mr. Matthias Rust. He was an exceptionally naive young man who, aged 19 in 1987, at the height of the Cold War, decided to fly his civilian 4-seat Cessna Skyhawk aircraft from Germany to Moscow via Finland in a gesture of peace and friendship. Incredibly, although he should have been shot down immediately, he was entirely untroubled by the layers of Russian ground and air-based defenses throughout his flight. He was certainly noticed a couple of times that the command and control system responsible for tracking was incoherent and confused. When he landed in Red Square in Moscow, it was an appalling embarrassment for the Soviet leadership. The fate of the senior Soviet air defense commanders can only be imagined. And so fast forward to 2024. In April, a Carnegie report assessed Russian anti-drone air defenses as inept, noting that large, slow-moving Ukrainian drones could still float in over the target in broad daylight, choosing their aiming point and approach route carefully and not be at any significant risk. On 5th of April, a particularly successful drone strike hit Rostov military airbase, reportedly destroying at least 6 aircraft. The drone attacks against Russian oil production and refining capability look to be intensifying. Fuel and oil are crucial to the Russian war effort and also to civilian life, but the debate about the value of small attacks against refineries and plants is still ongoing. The majority of Russian refining capability is way to the east, beyond the Ural Mountains, and realistically is still well out of reach of drones. Putin has prioritized fuel for the military, even if it means hardship for Russian civilians. The damage caused by drones is still relatively small and repairs can be made quickly. Most refineries damaged in a drone strike are usually up and running again within a couple of weeks. But other analysts are more upbeat about the impact. The Economist, a political analytical journal, has claimed that the Ukrainian drone attacks have knocked out a seventh, around 14%, of Russian oil refining capability in total, and that the single attack on the refinery on April 2nd accounted for 3% of capacity. Although Ukraine struggles to sustain waves of attacks died down after the Russian presidential elections, the overall impact of attacks on Russian refineries is significant. The attacks are forcing Russia to take some very expensive and highly public measures to protect its fuel assets, including banning petrol exports, importing fuel from Belarus, and also asking Kazakhstan for assistance. This shows that Russia is experiencing some discomfort from the attacks. Both The Economist and the Carnegie analysts conclude that at present, Ukraine can make and fire drones at Russian refineries at a faster rate than Russia can repair the damage. But there's more. Let's take a look at another aspect of the strategic drone war. Ukraine has next to no navy. Its one frigate was deliberately sunk by the navy to stop it falling into Russian hands. But Ukraine has reinvented naval warfare almost single-handedly by turning to seaborne drones as a means of attacking Russian ships, ports, and naval installations. 6 suicide drones filled with explosives and piloted remotely were reportedly used for the first time in October 2022 as they attempted to ram Russian warships in Sevastopol harbor. This attack is believed to have seriously damaged the frigate Admiral Makarov, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and a minesweeper, the Ivan Golubets. Russian anti-drone defenses, often little more than men armed with machine guns on the decks of their ships, have struggled to find a solution to the threat from very small and fast-moving vessels, often moving at night. The Ukrainians claim to have sunk at least 5 Russian ships with sea drones. These drones have conducted multiple operations around the Black Sea, and now Ukraine can justifiably claim to have the world's first fleet of naval drones. The Magura 5 naval drone is a good example of this new evolution in naval warfare. It's designed like a small motorboat that sits low in the water. It's hard to spot by the naked eye, is made of plastic to avoid radar detection, and does not give off much heat, which thwarts thermal cameras. The Ukrainian commander of a sea drone unit notes that when Russians fire at the drones with tracer rounds, it makes it easier to see where the Russians are firing from and allows evasion measures. Its performance is impressive. With a payload of up to 320 kilograms, it has a range of 800 kilometers and can travel at up to 80 kilometers per hour. The capability of these drones is improving month by month, and the strategic impact of a relatively small number of drones on the Russian Navy has been incredible. The Russians have effectively retreated from the Black Sea and have now pulled back the bulk of the Black Sea fleet hundreds of kilometers east to the port of Novorossiysk on the eastern coast of the Black Sea. Impartial analysts and Ukrainians alike have declared that Ukraine is winning the battle for the Black Sea. With the Russian Navy seemingly no longer willing to contest the Black Sea, this protects Ukraine's southern flank from amphibious attacks, puts Russian-held Crimea in a precarious position, and allows Ukraine to export grain out into the Mediterranean for much-needed revenue. It's clear that Ukraine is achieving military wonders with limited resources but a lot of creative thinking. Although a small fleet of air and sea drones is still unlikely to be a war winner, Ukraine is scoring major military and propaganda victories. But Russia still has a lot of resources, and the situation on the front lines recently appears to be shifting in favor of Russia. Drones are no substitute for artillery shells, modern tanks, and fighter aircraft. Be sure to let us know what you think Ukraine's next steps in the drone war could be, and how you think Russia might respond.
At the 2024 Lennart Meri Conference in Tallinn, representatives of the 3 Baltic nations delivered a chilling warning to attendees. We're getting ready to march into Ukraine. All 3, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, are ready to cross the border into Ukraine to help defend it against Russia, regardless of whether they have approval from NATO. In doing so, they would escalate tensions with Russia to near breaking point while creating a massive dilemma for NATO. Should it join the Baltic nations in more directly defending Ukraine, or sit back and wait to see how Russia responds? One thing is clear: the Baltic states see Russia's rising aggression as a major threat to their sovereignty, and that raises some key questions. What would convince the Baltics to send soldiers into Ukraine, and why would they want to do so in the first place? What are the implications for NATO? Plus, exactly how much of an impact would the militaries of these 3 countries have should they enter Ukraine? Let's start by digging deeper into the Baltic announcement. In May 2024, Yahoo News reported on several members of the Baltic states attending the Lennart Meri conference. There, they issued their warning to representatives from Germany, claiming that they were collectively prepared to march into Ukraine. Those threats, the outlet says, come as a result of all 3 nations being frustrated with Germany's approach to the use of its weapons in the Ukraine war. Namely, they're not happy that Germany has yet to permit Ukraine to use German-supplied weapons on Russian territory. The Baltic countries see the German response as half-hearted. They think it will do little to deter Russia if President Vladimir Putin and his troops know that they can focus on Ukraine without worrying about strikes on Russian territory. Worse yet, they open the door for Russia to gain significant ground in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern region of Kyiv. If that happens, those gains would represent a major threat to both the Baltic states and Poland. Cautioning restraint, as Germany is doing, could backfire, according to the Baltics. After all, it could lead to Russia finally taking Ukraine, perhaps giving Putin the springboard he needs to launch other invasions in the Baltics. However, it's important to note at this point that none of the Baltics have sent troops into Ukraine yet. They may not even do so. Militani, a Ukrainian news website focused on war in the military, suggests that the Baltics would only consider troop deployment if Russia makes significant frontline gains due to Ukraine not having sufficient Western support. In other words, the Baltics are focusing as much on their own defense as that of Ukraine. Russian success in the latter could spell bad news for the former. This is far from the only indication that the Baltics are getting ready to fight. Another Militani report, this time from May 20, 2024, notes that Estonia's Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, has pointed out that there are troops from several countries in Ukraine already. Those soldiers provide training to Ukraine's forces. Estonia isn't one of those countries yet, with Kallas saying that such an action would require parliamentary approval. But she also says it's an open, public discussion, but I think we shouldn't rule anything out right now. In other words, Estonia sending troops into Ukraine is a possibility. There are also reports of the Baltics shoring up their border defenses to consider. In March 2024, The Conversation published an article discussing the collective decision of the defense ministers of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to create a shared Baltic common defense zone along their borders in January. Though full details of this zone aren't available, it's believed it will contain several physical defensive structures, including bunkers. In fact, Estonia is set to begin construction on 600 of these bunkers in 2025, in addition to working alongside the other Baltic states to develop missile artillery. The country has also doubled the size of its territorial defense force to 20,000. Latvia is doubling the size of its armed forces as well to 61,000 by 2032 and reintroduced mandatory military conscription in 2023. As for Lithuania, The Conversation says it has formed an agreement that allows it to install a permanent brigade of 4,800 soldiers on the border it shares with Russia by 2027. In short, the Baltic states are preparing for war. That's where NATO might come into play. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all NATO members, having joined the organization in March 2004. That membership entitles them to collective defense as part of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which states that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. As such, every other NATO country is duty-bound to jump to the defense of any of the Baltic nations if Russia attacks them. Defense is the key word here. If the Baltic countries decide to enter Ukraine on their own volition, would the rest of NATO consider any Russian strikes resulting from that decision to be grounds to fight alongside the Baltics? After all, Russia would argue that the Baltic states provoked the attacks by joining Ukraine on the battlefield, meaning they're the aggressors. Other NATO members may argue that Article 5 doesn't apply in this situation because they won't be defending the Baltic states from Russia. They would be joining it in an attack on the Russian Federation. However, the Baltics represent an important buffer zone between Russia and the rest of Europe. NATO can't allow Russia to take those three states. It would give Russia more control over the Baltic Sea, as well as important strategic positions it might use to intimidate or attack Sweden, Finland, Poland, and other nearby nations. Perhaps NATO members might find themselves in a catch-22 situation. Either they treat a Russian response to the Baltic nations as enough to trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, meaning they also get involved in the Ukraine war, or they sit back and wait, potentially allowing a situation in which Russia gains more territory and becomes an even greater threat to the rest of Europe. That may be the point from the Baltic perspective. Rather than waiting for NATO to act, which all three agree is an invitation to Russia to continue its aggression, they'll take the situation into their own hands. In doing so, they'll force a decision from their NATO allies: fight with us or risk losing us to the Russian Federation. It's a dangerous game, though one all three seem willing to play. The question is simple: why? Why are Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all three of which combined likely can't defeat the Russian military, so willing to risk incurring Putin's wrath by sending their troops into Ukraine? There are several answers to this question, with one already having been discussed. The Baltic countries believe that much of the Western response to the Ukraine crisis has been underwhelming. They argue that nobody seems to be taking the true threat Russia poses, as they see it, seriously, and that Russia may target them next if they succeed in Ukraine. Better to get ahead of the issue by fighting in Ukraine than waiting for Ukraine to fall and reacting to what Russia does next. As for why the three nations believe that they're potential targets for Putin, all three will see historical parallels between themselves and Ukraine. After all, just like Ukraine, they fell under Soviet rule in the aftermath of World War II. For Latvia, that resulted in a complete loss of its independent democracy. Though the territory had spent most of its history being ruled by other countries, the Russian Revolution of 1917 opened the door for Latvia to declare its independence from Russia in 1918. 2 years later, following fighting with both Russia and Germany, the budding Soviet Union recognized Latvia as an independent country. That independence existed under a democratic structure until 1934, when President Kalaris Ulmanis established autocratic rule. Then 1939 came along, and Latvia was essentially merged into the Soviet Union, first being forced to hand over military bases to the Red Army before being fully occupied by Russia in 1940. Though the Soviets played a large part in defeating the Nazis that claimed Latvia between 1941 and 1944, that help came at a huge cost. Latvia officially became part of the Soviet Union after the war, with Russia collectivizing its farms in 1949 and integrating its economy into that of the Soviet Union. The National History Museum of Latvia notes that this early occupation, particularly the years under Joseph Stalin's regime until 1953, was marked by arrests, imprisonments, and deportations. The first year of Soviet occupation alone brought with it the deportation of about 35,000 native Latvians, most part of the country's intelligentsia, with many thousands more following in later years. Exclusion from education, constant exposure to Soviet propaganda, and the Soviet Union trying to instill its concept of planned economy in Latvia were all hallmarks of this time in the country's history. Yet a large contingent of the nation's population yearned for the days before Russia arrived, the 20 or so years in which it was independent. When the Soviet Union was finally on the brink of collapse, Latvia managed to obtain its independence once again. August 21, 1991 saw the country become a separate state. Its people have no intention of allowing today's Russia to return it to Soviet rule. Estonia and Lithuania have similar stories. For Estonia, annexation by the Soviet Union came on August 6, 1940. Thousands tried to resist, with the University of Central Arkansas stating that 1,750 Estonians were killed as a result of the country's resistance. Tragically, a further 7,450 died between August 1940 and September 1944. As seen in Latvia, the Soviet regime began mass deportations even before the end of World War II, which culminated in 10,200 Estonians being sent to Siberian labor camps. A further 35,000 Estonians were conscripted into the Soviet military between July and August 1941. Again, like Latvia, Estonia fell under the Nazi regime during the middle stages of World War II. And again, as seen in Latvia, the Soviet Union successfully fought the Nazis off. But that period of fighting led to 70,000 Estonians fleeing to Sweden and Germany, along with a further 250,000 displacements and 39,000 more deaths. Following the war, Estonia became part of the Soviet Union. Early Soviet rule forced even more devastation on the nation's people. Over 2 days in March 1949, the Soviets deported some 20,700 Estonians to Siberian labor camps, of whom 3,750 died during the journey. More imprisonments came under Stalin, with the years between 1944 and 1951 seeing 30,000 Estonians arrested under political pretenses. Some in the country tried to resist. A collective calling itself the Forest Brothers, which was 15,000 people strong, staged an insurgency in 1944. It was to no avail. Estonia, like Latvia, fell under the Soviet yoke. Estonia was a little faster to throw off the Soviet Union than Latvia. September 1988 saw around 250,000 Estonians take part in pro-independence demonstrations. 2 years later, there was a call for independence by the Estonian Supreme Council. An official declaration followed on August 20, 1991, just 1 day before Latvia gained its own independence. Then there's Lithuania. In many ways, Lithuania's history echoes that of Estonia and Latvia. Lithuania had enjoyed around 20 years of independence from Russian rule before June 1940, when the Soviet Union invaded the country. It forced Lithuania to cut all of its existing political ties. Lithuania was also subject to a secret protocol within the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. It stated that any territorial arrangement of the Baltic region would see the country's northern boundary represent the end of the Soviet influence and the beginning of Nazi territory. As with Latvia and Estonia, the first 2 years of Soviet occupation saw mass deportations. Around 35,000 native Lithuanians were forced out of the country before Germany launched an attack of its own. Again, the story mirrors that of the other Baltic states, several years of Nazi occupation before the Soviet Union regained control. A guerrilla resistance existed in the country between the mid-1940s and early 1950s. Numbering about 40,000, these forces tried to combat the Russification of Lithuania and the repression that came with it. It failed, with Russia's extensive deportations cutting huge swathes out of the resistance until Lithuania was forced to comply with the Soviet systems being imposed on it. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the period between 1947 and 1949 alone saw 220,000 Lithuanians get deported. Many would be sent to labor camps in Siberia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union enforced the collectivization of agriculture, as it had in Latvia, yet underground resistance existed. For instance, Lithuania produced more samizdat, or unsanctioned publications, than any other country in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. As with its Baltic neighbors, the desire for independence existed. That desire was realized in 1990 when elections in Lithuania resulted in a legislature that declared the country's independence. The Soviets attempted to topple the newly independent government in January 1991. That attempted coup failed, and as we saw with Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania secured full independence in August 1991. Understanding this history is key to recognizing the Baltic position. All three countries have lived under Russian repression. They fought hard for their independence, and they know that they'll likely be the next targets if Putin succeeds in Ukraine. After all, as Putin made clear during his February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson, the restoration of territory to Russia is one of the main motivations behind his actions in Ukraine. He sees Ukraine as part of Russia based on historical context. He likely sees the Baltics in the same way. All were part of the Soviet Union between the 1940s and 1990s, and all fell under Russian control prior to the country's 1917 revolution. The Baltic nations have also had to watch Russia grow increasingly aggressive over the last 2 decades. While the special military operation in Ukraine is the most obvious example of this aggression, they won't ignore Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. Then there's the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, which was over in just days, but marked the first war Europe saw in the 21st century. Like the Baltic states, Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. Worse yet, the response to Russia's invasion of the country from the international community was surprisingly muted, an early sign to the Baltic states that their allies weren't taking Putin's aggression seriously. They believe they can't afford to allow the rest of Europe to make the same mistake. And these aren't the only reasons why the Baltic states are considering entering Ukraine. Putin has also made direct threats to all three of them. On May 22, 2024, mere days before the Baltic nations discussed sending troops into Ukraine at the Lennart Meri conference, Politico reported on a Russian draft decree. Though that decree is now deleted, it showed a Russian proposal for the redrawing of its borders within the Baltic Sea. The proposal would essentially see Russia take control of sea territory currently overseen by Finland and Lithuania, with the latter being quick to respond that the draft represented little more than a threat. As Lithuania's foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, said to Politico, Russia's actions are seen as deliberate, targeted, escalatory provocations to intimidate neighboring countries and their societies. This is further proof that Russia's aggressive and revisionist policy is a threat to the security of neighboring countries and Europe as a whole. Perhaps that statement could be more accurately categorized as yet another wake-up call delivered to Europe from the Baltic states. Finally, there's Sweden and Finland's decision to join NATO to consider. While certainly good news for NATO as a collective, and the Baltic states in terms of their concerns about Russia, it also brought more threats from Putin. That's because Putin recognizes that Sweden and Finland being part of NATO opens up the Baltic Sea to NATO's forces. Bad news for Russia, given that it sees the Baltic Sea as strategically important to its navy. Its exclave Kaliningrad, for instance, is home to the only Russian port on the Baltic Sea that's available all year round. An increased NATO presence in that region could provoke action from Russia's president. The narrative around Sweden and Finland joining has certainly suggested that many NATO members consider their decision a victory in the Baltic region. Chatham House points out that some have even started to refer to the sea as a NATO lake. Now the collective can run more training operations and is in a better place to defend itself from Russian aggression. However, the decision also opens the door for Russia to push back, potentially leading to it taking a more aggressive stance against the Baltic states. If it does, those states argue, NATO needs to be as ready as they are to fight back. All of which brings us back to the Baltic statements about heading into Ukraine with or without NATO. If they follow through, what can they deliver to Kyiv? All three have already been massive supporters of Ukraine during the war. They each fall into the top 5 in terms of military aid provided as a percentage of gross domestic product or GDP. Latvia has provided 1.5% of its GDP, combined with bilateral donations and those made via the European Union, while Estonia and Lithuania have each provided 1.8%. They also led the way in terms of institutionalizing the aid they provide. Lithuania, for example, has pledged to offer constant support to Ukraine through 2026. The Baltic states see these contributions as being akin to their bolstering their own defenses. All are also engaged in concerted campaigns of de-Russification. Latvia has adopted a new law that will see Russian language teaching phased out of public education by 2025. In July 2023, Lithuania stripped residency permits from 135 Russians living in the country, all of whom it deemed security threats. Estonia has taken similar action, in addition to barring Russians from crossing its border soon after the Ukraine war began. The message is clear from all three. They not only oppose the war, but are actively trying to rid themselves of the Russian influences that remain following the Soviet Union's collapse. As for the direct military assistance each could provide, it's important to note that none of the Baltic states are considered particularly strong, especially when compared to Russia. In Global Firepower's 2024 ratings of 145 military nations, all land in the bottom half of the list. Estonia's position of 87 out of the 145 is the best the Baltics can muster. But that doesn't mean they would not be useful in the fighting. Starting with Latvia, the lowest ranked of the three at 99, the country has 65,750 military personnel, of whom 17,250 are part of its active military. The rest make up its reserves, along with 12,500 that are part of paramilitary groups. Unfortunately for Ukraine, Latvia has no tanks, though it maintains a stock of 1,544 vehicles. It could also bring 59 units of self-propelled artillery into Ukraine, as well as lean on its 6 mine warfare vessels to cause issues in the Baltic Sea. An underwhelming force perhaps, especially when considering who Latvia will be fighting, but that small army will be propped up by Lithuania and Estonia. GFP says that Lithuania could bring more military personnel into Ukraine, as it has 141,150 in total. Granted, only 23,000 of those people are part of its active military. However, it has 104,000 reservists upon whom it could call, along with 14,150 paramilitary troops. Like Latvia, it has no tanks to offer, though it can bring about 1,300 vehicles to the fight. Add to that its self-propelled artillery and towed artillery, 21 and 54 units respectively, and you have a decent amount of ground warfare equipment. Like Latvia, Lithuania's navy is small, consisting of just 11 assets. However, 4 of those are mine warfare ships, creating the potential for it to team up with Latvia to make the Baltic Sea a more dangerous place for Russian ships. Lithuania would also be able to bring a handful of helicopters and fixed transports to the fight. Finally, there's Estonia. The most powerful of the three according to GFP's rankings. Estonia has 96,500 military personnel, of whom 7,700 are active. It brings 6 units of rocket artillery to the conflict, along with 24 self-propelled artillery units. Plus, it could add another 1,409 vehicles to Ukraine's forces. A handful of helicopters and fixed-wing transports would also prove useful, as might Estonia's small navy. It could add 4 more mine warfare ships to the Baltic Sea. These stats show that none of the Baltic nations are powerhouses, but perhaps that isn't the point. The 3 states will feel a certain kinship with Ukraine, having all previously fallen under Soviet rule themselves. They'll also see Putin making threats against them, and likely consider themselves the next target should Ukraine fall. For that reason, they'd enter the conflict with motivation, not only to help Ukraine but to defend themselves. They could potentially stretch the war's front lines to include their borders, spreading Russia's troops thin in the process, and use their navies to force Russia to expend resources in the Baltic Sea. Then there's the NATO question. Would the Baltic states entering Ukraine serve as a signal to NATO, and particularly the organization's European states, that it has to get involved? Maybe that's what the Baltic states hope for. All 3 will know that their militaries aren't powerful enough to cause major problems for Russia without support from the West. By entering Ukraine, they may seek to show just how fragile the Baltic buffer between Russia and Europe is, forcing NATO to respond to prevent Russia from taking their territory. If so, it's a risky gambit. Only time will tell if the Baltic nations follow through on their proclamations that they'll enter the Ukraine war if Russia takes more ground. With that, we conclude today's video. Let us know what impact you think Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia could have on the Ukraine war if they joined. Would they manage to force NATO's hand? Or would the rest of Europe sit back and wait to see how it all pans out? Share your opinions in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out how war in Ukraine is de-Russifying the Baltic states, or click this other video instead. Russia's invasion of Ukraine failed to produce the quick victory that Vladimir Putin and indeed the wider world expected. Kyiv did not fall in days, as everyone assumed. The Ukrainian government survived, but this should not be as surprising as it once seemed. The mistake of assuming a rapid, decisive victory is one that military leaders and warring states have made since ancient times. Sun Tzu cautioned leaders who thought of uncomplicated victories that the worst policy of all is to besiege walled cities, and that there is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. Putin, like so many wannabe conquerors before him, failed to heed these warnings, and by March 2022 found himself in a prolonged war of attrition. No single decisive battle would end this war. Exhaustion from equipment losses and casualties would. It's now been over 2 years since the invasion began, and both sides have suffered from the latest instance of protracted warfare. But how many casualties have both sides taken since February 24, 2022? And how do these casualty figures tie into the ability of each of the warring countries to carry on the hostilities and walk away with a victory? First, it's helpful to remember that casualties do not equal people being killed in action. Casualties not only include those killed, but also wounded, captured, or missing. In 2021, Ukraine's population was about 44 million people. Russia's 2021 population was about 143.4 million, a figure 3.2 times as large. According to the Global Firepower Index, as of 2024, Ukraine has an available manpower of about 22 million, with 15.4 million fit for service and 476,000 reaching military age annually. Russia has 69.4 million, 46.4 million, and 1.2 million in each respective category. 2 years of war in Ukraine have produced hundreds of thousands of casualties in a combined total, but trying to determine more specific figures than that is a little trickier. For understandable reasons, both sides are reluctant to release their data. Looking at the size of the respective armies is a good way to start. Before Russia invaded, Ukraine had about 300,000 personnel between its regular armed forces and paramilitary troops. The war has swelled Ukraine's forces to about 2.2 million today, with an active duty force of 900,000. The rest are reserves and paramilitary forces, and not all of them are deployed at once. Russia, meanwhile, began the invasion with 190,000 troops. This was obviously not enough. By May 2023, after the partial mobilizations began, the number went up to 300,000, according to EU sources. By September, Russian forces in Ukraine had increased to 420,000, according to sources in Ukrainian intelligence. Russia's armed forces number 1.32 million active personnel, 2 million in reserve, and 250,000 paramilitary troops. Not all of these are deployed in Ukraine, as some of them need to patrol Russia's long borders, but more of the country's available troops have steadily been drawn in as the conflict continues. How many of these troops have become casualties? By June 2022, Ukraine reported that 10,000 of its men had been killed and an additional 30,000 injured. Russian losses were reported to be about 3 times that number. Accounting for overestimates, this is at least a reasonable idea because Ukraine was on the defensive as Russia attempted to sweep through the Donbas region. In September, Russia released figures supposedly showing that Ukraine had suffered 61,000 deaths and about 49,000 wounded, in comparison to about 50,000 Russian wounded and 10 times fewer casualties. These figures were plainly absurd, especially with Russian troops routing as Ukraine regained thousands of square kilometers of territory. 2023 brought more concrete, independent data. In August, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, PNAS, used 4,609 reports of military and civilian losses encompassing both sides and developed a statistical model to come up with a reasonably accurate estimate of each country's respective casualties. The authors tried to account for reporting biases on both sides. In particular, the study found that both sides overestimated the losses suffered by their respective opponents. Ukraine, they said, tends to magnify Russian deaths to twice what they actually are, while Russia estimated that Ukraine suffered 4 times as many fatalities as it actually did. PNAS also said that Russian sources underestimated their own casualty figures. The authors noted that Russia has suffered both more total casualties and a greater proportion of fatalities within its casualties, and Russian sources typically only report 1/3 of the deaths their armed forces actually suffer. PNAS estimated that by February 2024, Ukraine had suffered about 17,200 fatalities and about 33,000 injuries. At this point, Russia was taking tens of thousands casualties in the months-long battle for Bakhmut. That same month, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed that his forces had suffered 11,000 casualties in the battle, but Western officials said that between 20,000 and 30,000 Russian troops had become casualties there. These figures did not include the mercenaries from the then-active Wagner Group, which also suffered terrible losses in the battle, enough for it to rise in revolt against Moscow shortly after the city fell. Ukraine's garrison at Bakhmut had inflicted highly disproportionate casualties. But all was not well for Ukraine. As the Battle of Bakhmut raged, Ukraine was preparing for its counter-offensive in Zaporizhia. Western observers had high hopes for this operation and hoped that it would reach the Sea of Azov, cutting Russia's land bridge to Crimea. Unfortunately, Ukraine was unable to even come close to repeating the successes of 2022. The Ukrainian military wound up cracking the first 2 of Russia's 3 extensive defensive lines of Zaporizhia, but were unable to translate this momentum into a wider breakthrough. As Ukrainian forces flung themselves on the most elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since World War I, casualties naturally mounted. By August 2023, as the campaign in Zaporizhia raged, American sources estimated that Ukraine's casualties ballooned to a number between 100,000 and 120,000 injuries and 70,000 dead. Curiously though, Russia is regarded as having taken more casualties in this campaign than Ukraine, despite being on the defensive. In September, the Institute for the Study of War noted that Russia's Storm Z detachments with convict recruits had arrived to act as cover for units in the regular army, such as the airborne forces. With these troops being treated as cannon fodder, Russia was suffering hundreds of casualties per day, even as the Ukrainian offensive was failing to make strategic gains. With costly human wave tactics harkening back to many past wars, it should not be surprising that Russia has suffered far more fatalities than it officially reports. In June 2022, Russian sources claimed that they had suffered about 5,900 fatalities since the war began, but British intelligence sources estimated it to be nearly 3 times that, at roughly 15,000, and Ukrainian sources claimed it was over 30. Given the biases that PNAS mentioned, the British figure is likely the most trustworthy for that point in the war. By February 2023, PNAS's estimate for Russian casualties was roughly 150,000 injuries and almost 70,000 fatalities. In August, after the Russians had captured Bakhmut at an enormous cost and were suffering during Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia campaign, American intelligence sources estimated that Russia had suffered 120,000 fatalities during the course of the war, with an additional 170,000 to 180,000 injured. This would seem like a high proportion of deaths compared to the total casualties, and given their source, may be less than trustworthy compared to another figure released 2 months later. An independent investigation by the BBC and Mediazona, an anti-Putin Russian news outlet, used data from Russian cemeteries to conduct a statistical analysis. Through this study, they estimated that Russia had suffered at least 88,000 fatalities since the war started. A month later, a Ukrainian army official claimed on Facebook that Russia had suffered 170,000 injuries and over 150,000 deaths. The BBC Mediazona study is likely the closest to the truth. By March 2024, the British Ministry of Defence claimed that Russia had suffered 355,000 total casualties in the 2 years' war, amounting to about 983 per day. 2 months earlier, British officials predicted that Russia would suffer over 500,000 total casualties by the end of 2024. But these are military casualties only. Civilians have typically suffered the worst in war. Has it been the same this time? Russia has ignored the international humanitarian treaties that it's signed onto and attacked Ukrainian civilian population centers. Civilians in Russian-occupied areas have suffered even worse. In September 2022, UN sources estimated that there were 18,500 civilian injuries and 10,000 deaths in Ukraine. This would be a low ratio of civilian to military losses in historical wars. The UN said that the true figures could be much higher due to verification issues. Many of these casualties came during the siege of Mariupol that lasted between February and May 2022. Ukrainian sources claim that 25,000 civilians died there, although they would have wanted to magnify this number as part of the information warfare environment against Russia. UN sources confirmed 1,350 such deaths, but naturally estimated the number to be significantly higher. In January 2022, the city had a population of about 425,600 people. By May 2023, it had dropped to about 120,000, with the Institute for the Study of War citing Russian documentary evidence that plans were in place to ethnically cleanse the Ukrainian people there and replace them with Russians. UN sources claimed that 500 civilian deaths and 1,047 injuries were of children. Given that Russia has been known to attack at least one school in Kyiv with cluster bombs, an unambiguous war crime that resulted in the death of a child, this is likely an undercount. Cluster bombs often fail to detonate, with Russian bombs in particular having dud rates as high as 40%. These unexploded bombs in effect become landmines. This is why it should not be surprising that at least 303 of those civilian deaths and 676 injuries came from mines and abandoned explosives. Ukraine has since become the most heavily mined country in the world, and more civilians have undoubtedly been accidentally killed by these. The February 2023 PNAS study claimed that 13,000 Ukrainian civilians had died and about 19,000 had been injured. In February 2024, the UN released a new estimate, verifying 30,457 civilian casualties, with close to 11,000 killed and 20,000 injured. In a total war of attrition, inflicting civilian casualties helps to cripple the enemy economy by depriving it of labor and productive capacity. This was the case during World War II, and like in so many other ways, the Russian military seems to be taking this approach to the treatment of civilians in Ukraine, despite international humanitarian law. Since the war has mostly been fought on Ukrainian territory, Russia has suffered few civilian casualties. However, it's not escaped unscathed. Cross-border raids, such as the one in Belgorod in May 2023, and missile drone strikes have left their marks. By August 2023, 7x7, another Russian independent media source, estimated that there had been 105 civilian casualties. These were concentrated near the border with Ukraine. While wounded men can sometimes return to action, this is often not the case. By December 2023, at least 20,000 of Ukraine's wounded had required amputations, and according to a Russian source, that was perhaps being unusually honest. Over half of all the wounded Russian soldiers required amputation. Tens of thousands of troops are also suffering from mental health issues. Lack of adequate rotation, especially in the Russian lines, has led to a full-blown mental health crisis. Abuse of alcohol and other drugs is common. Although the reports vary, the conclusion seems inescapable that Russia has not only suffered more casualties than Ukraine, but at a disproportionate rate. However, because Russia has a significantly larger population, it can still more easily afford its casualties than Ukraine, since they are far more easily replaceable. There are additional problems for Ukraine in mobilizing its people to fight this war. Much of the population has become refugees since the invasion started. 8 million Ukrainians have been internally displaced between February and May 2022. An additional 8 million fled the country by the war's first anniversary. That amounts to 37% of the country's pre-war population. Although most of these refugees have been women and children who are either unfit for military service or are not fit for all tasks, experts estimate that at least 20,000 Ukrainian men fled to avoid being drafted. The situation seemed to improve for Ukraine by the end of 2022, as some of the refugees returned home, with the figures dropping down to 5.1 million internally displaced persons and 6.3 million Ukrainian refugees living abroad. Ukraine's successful counteroffensives drew some people back. However, the war has turned against Ukraine since then. There is a darker side to this population flow. About 1 million Ukrainian nationals have forcibly been deported to Russia. The Fourth Geneva Convention, which Russia has ratified, prohibits this, and so this practice is considered a war crime. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for some Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin, for this behavior. However, Ukraine is not the only one suffering a loss of available manpower through refugees. Russia has also suffered, and disproportionately, in the prime military demographic. When Vladimir Putin announced his partial mobilization in the autumn of 2022, hundreds of thousands of men left the country to avoid conscription. These people are often some of Russia's best and brightest, who contribute disproportionately to its economy. Between 800,000 and 900,000 total people have fled Russia since the start of the war. At least 250,000 men are among those refugees. These are all people that cannot be called on to do any military service, and their no longer being available is important for Ukraine, as it amounts to Russia essentially losing a year's worth of replacements for its soldiers. This is crucial if it wants to win the war of attrition. Nevertheless, Ukraine is suffering a much worse shortage of manpower, which is why the country's draft laws have been changed. In April 2024, the Ukrainian parliament passed a new law that made more people eligible for conscription. Ordinarily, Ukrainian men over the age of 27 had been subject to conscription upon the declaration of martial law. The legislature has since lowered the age to 25, but the law went further than broadening the draft pool. Ukraine's brass had complained that not enough troops are showing up to camp. Draft dodging has become common. As in most wars of this nature, the initial swell of patriotism has since given in to gloom as the cost of the conflict has revealed itself. Troops are no longer so eager to fight. To crack down on draft dodging, the new law requires men to update their conscription data with the authorities within 60 days. Draft dodging now also comes with stricter penalties. A proposal to insert time limits for mobilization was dropped, and military service remains open-ended. However, there are also new incentives. Volunteers now get more pay. The Ukrainian parliament has also loosened recruitment rules in another way. In a sign of the increasing pressure Ukraine is under, the new law takes a page out of Russia's playbook and permits convicts to join the army under some conditions. Women are still not required to serve, but earlier legislation expanded the number of professions in which they were mandated to register. Previously, only women serving in specialized roles such as medicine were required to register for military service. Now women in professions as varied as journalism and music can be mobilized if wartime conditions demand it. So far, women have not been forcibly mobilized, but as pressure mounts, that could change. These new measures inspired fierce opposition among the war-weary Ukrainian public, but casualties in the 2 years of fighting have taken their toll, and the military needs replacements. Ukraine's brass, such as General Yuri Sodol, who commands the forces in Kyiv, Donetsk, and Luhansk oblasts, lamented that he lacked manpower, with the Russian invaders outnumbering his troops by 7 to 10 times. This is not a winning formula in a war of attrition, even as Ukraine continues to inflict disproportionate casualties on Russian troops. Acknowledging that attrition, and not a decisive battle, would be key to winning this war, the Estonian Ministry of Defense claimed in December 2023 that Russia would need to kill or maim at least an additional 100,000 troops in 2024 in order for victory to be possible. The Estonians warned, "If undisrupted, Russia has the capacity to train approximately 130,000 troops every 6 months into cohered units and formations available for launching operations." This would lead to 260,000 new troops available per year, which in turn can sustain a total force of 420,000 troops in Ukraine. The Estonians said that Ukraine must increase the demand for Russian manpower to the point that Moscow cuts corners with its basic training and sends increasingly worthless replacements to the battlefield. These troops will die faster, leading to a feedback loop of Russia becoming increasingly desperate for manpower as the war spirals into an unsustainable cycle. To do this effectively, Ukraine must also mitigate its losses. The Estonians estimated that Ukraine suffered a total of 200,000 casualties just shy of the war's second anniversary. They recommended that Ukraine's Western allies help it to mitigate these casualties by providing better training to Ukrainian recruits. Over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been trained by its Western allies. However, the Estonians reported that this training was not to the same quality. For example, basic training in the US Army is 10 weeks, followed by months of additional training for specialized tasks. Ukrainian troops have only gotten 5 weeks in basic and presumably far less for specialized tasks. "It's time for us to set new objectives, a new pace, a new standard of quality in training," the Estonians concluded. This strategy of increasing Ukraine's lethality while training its soldiers to higher standards will require time though, time that Russia believes it has on its side. Ukraine has suffered severe shortages of ammunition in the first half of 2024 as Western aid slowed down. Aid picked up in the spring, with millions of shells and other vital ammunition set to arrive this summer. These packages should take Ukraine at least into 2025. Ukraine already killed or maimed well over 100,000 Russian troops in the first 2 years of the war. With such tools on hand, it's in a good position to meet the benchmark the Estonians have set for it, but difficulties have been multiplying. The British general Sir Richard Barrons warned in an interview with the BBC that a major Russian offensive looked to be coming this summer, which he thinks will be in Donbass and potentially toward Kyiv. In April, General Christopher Cavoli, the senior American commander in Europe, warned that Ukraine would need significantly more aid and ammunition. Such aid is now arriving, and with stubborn Russian human wave tactics, the new shells, missiles, and later in the year F-16s should give Ukraine the means to inflict the 100,000 deaths and permanent injuries the Estonians believe will be necessary. Only time will tell if the war takes a turn for the better, and Ukraine can use its new weapons to inflict the casualties it supposedly needs to. But one thing about the casualties in the fighting is clear. War may be a highly emotional matter, inspiring works of art and the consciousness of nations for thousands of years, but to the generals, it's often only a matter of math. What do the casualties in Ukraine reveal about the state of the war and the prospect for both sides? Will Ukraine be able to inflict the necessary casualties on Russia as its so-called shell hunger ends this summer? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to like this video and support the channel and hit the subscribe button for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out Putin's huge tank losses, or click this other video instead. Putin is done. Those are the words uttered by Peter Zeihan during a June 2024 interview with the Times Radio. Zeihan is an expert on geopolitics who has worked with Fortune 500 firms. The author of several books including The End of the World is Just Beginning and Disunited Nations, Zeihan made this claim in a reference to the future of both Putin and Russia's army. At various points during the interview, Zeihan argues that Putin is slowly losing his grip on power and that Ukraine is well positioned to launch a counter-offensive in the summer of 2024. That brings us to today's video. We're going to explore Zeihan's reasoning for his claims and highlight some of the issues that could lead to Putin ultimately losing the war in Ukraine. So is Putin really done? Zeihan's justifications for that claim start with the arrival of Patriot weapon systems and Western fighter jets in Ukraine. Starting with the Patriot systems, the Times Radio interviewer noted that the US had just announced that it would send another of those systems at a cost of $1.1 billion to Ukraine, adding that it's something that Ukraine badly needs. Each of these systems is capable of firing a 17-foot missile, with said munitions being equipped with a track-via missile targeting system that enables mid-course corrections while it's en route to its target. The missile can fly for 43 miles, reaching a maximum altitude of around 15 miles, and comes packed with a 198-pound warhead.
They're extremely powerful weapons. Their manufacturer, RTX, says that Patriot missiles can intercept ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as take out drones and other advanced aerial threats. And it's this, Zehan claims, that makes the delivery of more of them such a vital win for Ukraine. He says that it's important for people to think of what these Patriot systems can offer Ukraine over the next several months, as opposed to considering what has been happening during the early stages of 2024. The Ukrainians needed more air defense, claims Zehan, and the Russians were taking advantage of a lull in weapons deliveries to basically hit the Ukrainians with all kinds of air-based weapon systems. With more Patriots, Ukraine can shore up its aerial defenses. They alone won't be enough, however, as Patriot missile systems can only cover a limited, albeit somewhat broad, area, even though they have a long firing range. Where they really become important in terms of Putin losing his grip on the territory Russia has claimed in Ukraine, says Zehan, is where they're used in combination with the Western fighter jets that are on their way to the country. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, NATO member nations have committed to sending at least 65 F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. These jets, which are anticipated to enter service toward the end of 2024, won't be enough to grant Ukraine total air superiority over its own territory. They're too few in number, and even though Russia's aerial offensives have faltered, could be overwhelmed with sheer numbers. Instead, these jets, along with a shipment of several Mirage 2000 jets from France, would allow Ukraine to create brief pockets of aerial superiority. Those pockets could make a massive difference, according to Zehan, who says that creating them massively increases the capacity of the Ukrainian military to launch strikes. Every offensive the Ukrainians have attempted for the last 12 months has bogged down because they don't have air superiority, Zehan says. That will change through a combination of Patriot missile systems and the arrival of Western fighter jets. For the first time since the war began, Ukraine will be able to conduct offensives with aerial support. That means ground troops will be able to move quickly and in large numbers because they face fewer threats from Russia's artillery. For example, Ukraine could use Patriot missiles to disable aerial threats while relying on its F-16s to take out the artillery that typically peppers Ukrainian troops as they attempt to advance. This approach would not require Ukraine to establish total aerial dominance. Instead, it would create pockets of superiority, allowing for troop movements and offensives that can retake positions Russia has claimed. Ukraine will have more time to do things like clear mines on the battlefield and prepare for its attacks. Those attacks will also be more coordinated because they're not starting in conditions where Ukrainian troops are simply trying to survive artillery barrages. The stage could thus be set for counteroffensives that retake Ukrainian territory. In short, Russia starts to lose territory thanks to Ukraine's stronger aerial threat. Of course, there's an obvious counterpoint to Zehan's argument here. What's to stop Russia from using its own anti-air defenses to prevent Ukraine from achieving these pockets of aerial superiority? The answer lies in the S-400 Triumph surface-to-air, or SAM, missile system. Designed by Russia and entering service in 2007, the S-400 is supposed to be somewhat equivalent to America's Patriot missile systems. Missile Threat says that it's capable of shooting down cruise missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and aircraft, which should make it perfect for deploying against Ukraine's incoming F-16s. It's powerful too. Each S-400 missile can travel up to 248 miles and can carry a warhead weighing up to 315 pounds. Looking at the specifications alone, the S-400 is more powerful and rangier than Ukraine's Patriot missile systems, meaning that it should be more than capable enough of taking out F-16s and incoming missiles. But there's a problem. Russia has deployed S-400 systems frequently during the Ukraine war, and unfortunately for Putin, they've proven far less effective than Russia had anticipated. In September 2023, Newsweek reported that Ukraine was increasingly cutting away at Russia's supply of S-400s. The outlet reports that Russia had 96 of these SAM systems available at the beginning of 2023, with reports suggesting those numbers were being whittled down by the month. Quoting the Dutch open-source intelligence agency Oryx, Newsweek says that Russia had lost key components of at least 5 of its S-400 batteries in Crimea by September 2023. The situation has only gotten worse for Russia as the war moved into 2024. Writing for Forbes in June of that year, military commentator David Axe noted that a mid-May barrage of 10 Army tactical missile system rockets struck a base in Baltic within occupied Crimea. Each of these rockets weighed 2 tons and exploded to release hundreds of grenade-sized bomblets, creating a cluster bomb effect that devastated the Russian base. Among the equipment damaged there were 4 warplanes, along with a pair of S-400 launchers and a radar system. Russia replaced the S-400s. Ukraine bombed them again. This time, Ukraine took out 2 more S-400s, as well as one of Russia's older S-300 SAM systems. In short, Axe said, Ukraine is now in a position where it can take out Russia's S-400s as quickly as Russia can replace them in occupied Crimea.
All of that brings us back to Zihan's claims that Putin is losing his grip on power. Russia is soon going to face a Ukraine that can not only establish limited pockets of aerial superiority, but can also take out the very anti-air defenses Russia relies upon to prevent that superiority from happening. Worse yet, the destruction of so many S-400s leaves Putin with egg on his face, as what's supposed to be the most advanced SAM unit in the world has proven to be extremely vulnerable to Ukrainian weapons. That's not just a problem for Putin in terms of his attempts to project Russian power. Incidents like these are also reducing the interest that other countries have in Russian weapons. Zihan highlights India as one of these nations, noting that the loss of so many S-400s is showing that Russia's weapons aren't as capable as advertised to the nations that were buying them. In India's case, Politico noted in April 2024 that Russia would practically lose all of its customers from India in the coming months. The war in Ukraine has exposed the fabled prowess of Russian weaponry as a myth, the report claims. In truth, India's imports of Russian weapons have been declining before the Ukraine war. Between 2009 and 19, 76% of India's weapon imports came from Russia. That number has dropped to just 36% during the last 5 years, with Politico noting that it's likely to fall to zero very soon. Given that India has earmarked $100 billion for future weapon procurement, Putin faces a doubly bad situation when it comes to selling his weapons. Russia's biggest customer is jumping ship, costing the country a huge slice of that $100 billion, and it's likely going to spend the bulk of that money on Western weapons instead. Russia is weakened and the West is empowered. That's the opposite of what Putin hopes to achieve with the Ukraine war, which was intended to be a projection of Russian power and a demonstration of the country's ability to easily win a war. Instead, Russia has been bogged down in a war of attrition that's seen it lose an aura of invulnerability that Putin has spent the last 2 decades cultivating. With that loss of the aura, Zihan suggests, may come the loss of Putin's hold over Russia. It gets even worse for Putin. Combine the loss of so many S-400 SAMs with the destruction of around a third of Russia's dreaded Black Sea fleet, and you have a situation in which Russia could conceivably lose Crimea. The region, which was controlled by Ukraine until Russia annexed it in 2014, is at risk of becoming a non-factor in the war due to Ukraine's tactics. Could it be just literally a matter of time until Ukraine can shut down Russia in Crimea, cutting it off and stopping Russia's ability to support the war from there? Zihan asks during the interview. Answering himself, he claims that is definitely the goal for Ukraine. However, even if Ukraine isn't able to liberate Crimea, Zihan notes, it's in a strong tactical position to at least damage it extensively. That would cause major problems for Russia on the logistical front, given that Crimea is one of the country's main routes into Ukraine. Zihan points out that Russia has 2 routes in and out of Crimea, a rail route that tracks through Mariupol and the Kerch Bridge. Both are vulnerable to Ukrainian strikes, with the latter having already been targeted. In April 2024, The Guardian reported that Ukraine had already conducted 2 drone strikes on the bridge, with a third likely being considered for some point in 2024. Zihan agrees that the bridge will likely be a target, noting that Ukraine could probably target and destroy it right now, but is likely waiting until it receives more military capacity. Why does this matter in the context of Putin's grip on power? When you do that, Crimea goes from being a launch pad for Russian assaults to simply the most vulnerable part of the Russian landmass, claims Zihan. The loss of Crimea, or merely the loss of the ability to use it to keep troops supplied on the Ukrainian mainland, would be a huge blow to Putin. Strategically, Russia's army would weaken due to the logistical problems Ukrainian strikes would create. With no bridges and destroyed rail routes, Russia would be forced to use its Black Sea fleet to ship supplies into Ukraine. A third of that fleet has already been destroyed. And thanks to Turkey's control over the Turkish Straits, which leads into the Black Sea, Russia is unable to replenish the Black Sea fleet with new ships. Putin would face a logistical disaster, and one that would only get worse as time went on and Ukraine destroyed more of the Black Sea fleet. Then there's the symbolic aspect of taking Crimea. If Ukraine is able to not only destroy logistical routes, but enter Crimea and retake it from Russia, Putin would experience a massive shot to his power projection. He will lose what he considers Russian territory, again seeing the aura of invulnerability that surrounded both him and Russia getting chipped away. Still, the taking of Crimea is far from an inevitability, and may not even be possible, unless Ukraine receives even more weapons. Even so, Putin is still in a position where Ukraine can damage Crimea, destroy Russia's logistical solutions, and take out ships and weapons that Putin believed would be effective in the war. Putin's grip on power loosens further. That brings us to another problem that Putin faces: Western nations allowing Ukraine to use weapons they supply inside Russia. Several have done so already, with the UK essentially claiming that Ukraine can use the missiles it supplies in whatever way they see fit. while Germany and the US have also given their seal of approval. In the case of the latter, that approval is conditional. Ukraine can only use American weapons in the Kyiv region to strike Russia directly behind the border to prevent strikes in Kyiv itself. The US has also taken things a step further. In June 2024, it lifted a decade-long ban on the Azov Brigade, which had barred the transfer of weaponry and the use of US-supplied training to the group. This was a controversial step. The ban was in place because the Azov Brigade has neo-Nazi origins, which Russia has taken full advantage of in its propaganda by claiming that the US is now flirting with Nazis to get what it wants. America thinks differently. It says the Azov Brigade has passed a series of stringent tests based on the Leahy vetting process, finding that there is no evidence of gross violations of human rights committed by the 12th Brigade Azov. What does this mean for Russia and Ukraine? Ukraine gets a huge boost, and the Azov Brigade is one of the most battle-hardened units and will offer advantages on the battlefield. As for Russia, the approval showcases that Western nations, particularly the US, are becoming less escalation-phobic as the war drags on. Zihan claims that these moves represent the US becoming even more willing to cross red lines in how it's dealing with Russia. Red line is a term used by the Russian Federation to refer to any geopolitical action that it believes could damage the country's position. The use of Western or NATO-provided weaponry within Russia is one of those red lines. So far, Zihan claims, the West has crossed 34 of these lines, with the use of Western military technology being the most recent. Why does crossing these red lines matter to Putin? The simple answer is that every instance of crossing a red line has been met with threats of retaliation by Russia. However, none of those threats have been realized. Zihan says that it's likely that Russia's red line threats were intended to slow down Western involvement, giving it more time to damage Ukraine, so the increasing crossing of them now represents the West taking a more aggressive approach to Russia. So Putin now faces a twofold problem that could weaken his grip on power. With Western approval, Ukraine has already started striking targets within Russia. Zihan brings up Ukraine's targeting of a radar system nestled a couple of hundred miles within Russia that was designed to help with ballistic missile defense. Those types of strategic assets are now on the table for Ukraine, meaning it can not only chip away at the Russian war machine within its territory, but also take out supporting equipment inside Russia. The result is the opening up of more opportunities for Ukrainian counteroffensives due to the weakening of Russia's military. Secondly, and perhaps far more worryingly for Putin, the West's willingness to allow Ukraine to use its weapons suggests that the West no longer takes him seriously. At least not so seriously that it believes his threats of imminent retaliation for crossing a red line. This doesn't mean that the West believes war with Russia isn't possible in the future. Even as far back as January 2024, NATO officials were claiming that the organization needed to be ready for war. That month saw NATO Military Committee Chief Rob Bauer claim, "We have to realize it's not a given that we are in peace, and that's why we are preparing for a conflict with Russia." So the problem for Putin isn't that the West flat out doesn't believe he might retaliate, it's that the West is getting ready to fight back, meaning Putin's constant attempts to project power are failing. And that brings us to another of Zihan's justifications for his opinion that Putin is losing his grip on power. The Russian political system is built around the concept of a strongman. Russian politics are quirky, claims Zihan. It's a strongman system, and it's always been a strongman system. Putin specifically rules through the intelligence service, which is a combination of the rule of terror and the rule of infiltration. While that form of rule is fairly stable, in the sense that it allows Putin to generally get what he wants done, it's also fairly brittle. One big change could topple the whole thing. Zihan points to several examples throughout Russian history, noting that the year before every coup or revolution the country has seen provided little cause for alarm for those in charge. But there was always a trigger event. The loss of the Crimean War damaged the Tsars, for instance. Their system collapsed following the loss in the October Revolution, according to Zihan. The Cuban Missile Crisis offers another example. It precipitated the fall of Nikita Khrushchev. In other words, a Russian realization that it has lost, and lost big, is often a trigger for a complete change in the country's leadership. The people stop buying into the propaganda, and the strongman at the top weakens to the point that he falls. That major loss hasn't come for Russia in the Ukraine war, says Zihan. However, there are signs that Putin is starting to lose the propaganda battle. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs highlighted this in May 2024, when a survey it conducted found that 72% of young adult Russians don't trust any media outlet in the country to publish unbiased and factual information. Even more worrying for Putin, 24% of those younger Russians are more likely to trust the information they get from social media, almost matching the 25% who say they trust state-owned newspapers. The message here is that many younger Russians are veering away from relying on state-owned news sources, another massive chip taken away from Putin's strongman image.
The potential fall of Crimea is the only thing on the short-term horizon that could serve as the one big event that topples Putin. But even that might not be enough, at least when taken alone. Zihan posts a worrying potential example of what he means, noting that Ukraine may be able to advance to the Crimean coast. Doing that while cutting off all means of supply to the region by taking out rail lines and the bridges between Crimea and the Ukrainian mainland could allow Ukraine to turn Crimea into what Zihan dubs a death camp. The camp would be run by Russian leadership already stationed in Crimea, Zihan claims, and would see Russian people living in Crimea start to starve and die. Zihan notes that Russia already destroyed the Kakhovka Dam, meaning there's no more irrigation in Crimea for agriculture. Its food is imported, which means Ukraine blockading Crimea from the coast and destroying its logistical systems would be devastating, making the rest of the world, including Russia, aware that Russians are dying in the streets of Crimea, which is under Russian rule, could be more effective than taking the territory back. It could also be a big enough incident to finally topple Putin as the strongman leader. Speaking of people dying, the conversation later turns to the sheer scale of deaths Russia has experienced during the Ukraine war. Times Radio notes the number of Russians who died in the 10-month battle for Bakhmut equal the number of soldiers who died during the 10-year Afghan war. Worse yet for Russia, the total number of Russian deaths reached 545,090 on July 2, 2024, according to the official website of Ukraine. Putin has been sending his soldiers into a meat grinder. This isn't a new situation for Russia, Zihan argues, as the human wave approach has been used by the country multiple times over the centuries. The problem for Putin comes in the availability of manpower. Zihan claims that Russia had around 8 million men in their 20s when the war started. They've lost 500,000 of those men on the battlefield, he says, with up to 1 million more having fled the country. The fleeing figures are backed by Al Jazeera, which reported that up to 1 million Russians had left their home country as of January 2024. That leaves Russia with 6.5 million bodies to throw at the Ukrainian problem. And as Zihan points out, Russia hasn't fully mobilized yet. Its draft system has targeted the ethnically and economically disadvantaged thus far, says Zihan, and we haven't really seen what the core of the country can offer in terms of sheer manpower. That should be good news for Putin in terms of maintaining his power base, were it not for a major problem. Zihan believes the Ukraine war could rage for another 8 years. Though that does sound like a long time, Zihan says to keep two things in mind. First, Russia always does long wars. It does short intimidations, he says, but Russia typically gets dragged into drawn-out conflicts that it wins simply by having more people to throw at the war. But the human wave approach creates a major challenge for Putin, bringing us to the second thing Zihan says to consider. If Russia continues with its human wave strategy and gets dragged into an 8-year war, there won't be enough Russians under age 20 left to repopulate the country once the war ends. Russia's declining population has been a key social issue in the country for several decades. In 1993, its population reached a peak of 149 million, according to the Bank of Finland Institute for Emerging Economies, or BOFIT. At the end of 2023, it stood at 146.2 million, though that falls to 144 million if you subtract those living in Crimea. Regardless, BOFIT notes that Russia's population has either been flat or has declined every year since 2000. In 2023, just 1.27 million babies were born in the country, which is the lowest birth rate for over 20 years. More worrying for Russia is that there's also been a steep decline in the number of people aged between 25 and 30 living in the country. That figure is now 5 million fewer than it was in 2013. BOFIT also notes that Russia's current population figures are being buoyed by immigration. Take that migration away, along with removing populations from Russia's occupied territories, and its population would have shrunk by about 12 million people since 2000. So Russia already has a birth rate problem. The problem will only be exacerbated if the Ukraine war drags on for as long as Zihan predicts, as an even longer war forces Russia to mobilize further. That means more young people entering the meat grinder and being killed as a result, leading to even fewer people left in Russia to have children. Zihan's opinion: when this is done, one way or another, Russia is done. Perhaps his realization of this is why Putin is recruiting so many soldiers from abroad. The Radio Times interviewer notes the June 2024 arrest of a pair of Sri Lankan generals who were accused of aiding Russia in its war. Since that arrest, several outlets have suggested those generals, and others like them, have been duped into fighting the war. They don't want to be there. They didn't realize they would be fighting in Ukraine. Still, Putin wouldn't care either way. He simply gets more men to add to his human wave approach. Zihan notes that this appears to be part of Russia's strategy. That doesn't surprise me at all. There are Nigerians fighting in Ukraine. There are foreign exchange students that the Russians have press-ganged into fighting in Ukraine. So this is not a new strategy for the Russians.
He notes that Russia used this strategy extensively during the Cold War too, leading to Russia forming strange press-ganged brigades of foreign soldiers that it doesn't advertise. Perhaps Putin's use of it now is both a recognition of the difficult situation Russia finds itself in when it comes to its population, as well as a sign of desperation. Get anybody it can into the meat grinder to try and wear Ukraine down. So where does all of this leave Putin? He faces a war that could be drawn out for many years, which could potentially result in the loss of millions more Russians. The younger population would bear the brunt of these losses, not only feeding into Russia's current population challenges, but also presenting labor issues once the war concludes. Putin also faces a resurgent Ukraine that's able to establish pockets of air superiority while using weapons supplied by its Western allies to strike Russia in its own territory. Speaking of the West, it's collectively becoming more confident in crossing Russia's red lines, with the rhetoric from NATO suggesting that it's preparing for an upcoming war with Russia. Putin is trying to balance an extremely delicate situation. If Zihan is correct, Russia's missteps in the war, combined with existing societal issues, are chipping away at the strongman image that has been so essential to his leadership. With that image weakened, it may only take one major event, such as the starving out of Crimea or the loss of the war entirely, to finally put an end to Putin's time as Russia's president. But what do you think? Is there any chance that Putin may lose his seat of power before the Ukraine war ends, or is his position stronger than Zihan suggests? Share your opinions in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Russia is on the brink of collapse, or click this other video instead. Air superiority is the single most decisive factor in modern warfare. The side that controls the skies gets to dictate the course of the battles below on both land and sea. For 2 long years, Russia has been the dominant force in the air over Ukraine as the Russo-Ukrainian war rages on. But Ukraine might soon be able to tilt the balance in its favor and reclaim the skies from the grip of its oppressor, all thanks to a single weapon system, the F-16 Fighting Falcon. The imminent arrival of the F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine promises to be a game-changer in the conflict, but only if Ukraine plays its cards right. Now, what do we mean by that? Stick around to find out. First, let's discuss why Ukraine needs the F-16 fighter jets in the first place. The answer is simple. As things stand, Ukraine has a modest air fighting force at best. This force is primarily made up of Soviet-era equipment that includes the Sukhoi Su-27 and the Mikoyan MiG-29 twin-engine fighter aircraft. Though these aircraft can be a formidable adversary in the right hands, as Ukraine has already proven, they simply lack the advanced capabilities a modern battlefield demands. To make matters worse, Ukraine's already lackluster air force has been severely depleted since Russia invaded the country on February 24, 2022. According to some estimates, Ukraine has lost over 300 total aircraft during this period, unmanned aerial vehicles included. Ukrainian officials have also acknowledged the difficulties in repairing and replacing the damaged aircraft. In a twisted turn of events, the only country that produces the spare parts for Ukraine's damaged Soviet-era aircraft is Russia, the very same country that damaged those aircraft in the first place. This dependency has severely hampered Ukraine's ability to maintain its air force and has highlighted the urgent need for modernization and diversification of its military assets. That's where the Western-made F-16s come into play. But why F-16s in particular? There are plenty of reasons Ukraine and its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, have been desperately trying to get their hands on these fighter jets since the very beginning of the invasion. You see, the F-16 fighter jets are significantly more adept at targeting and destroying ground targets compared to Ukraine's fleet of Soviet-era aircraft. Their laser-guided precision bombs can wreak havoc on virtually any enemy position with unparalleled accuracy. Besides accuracy, the F-16 will improve the distance and speed at which Ukraine can conduct airstrikes. The F-16 can fly at twice the speed of sound and strike targets on the ground more than 500 miles away. This should allow Ukraine to take out Russia's ground-based defenses more easily. The F-16s are also equipped with more modern electronic systems and better radars. This adds to their ability to detect and engage targets more effectively while also allowing them to be more survivable in hostile airspace. According to some predictions, the F-16 versions sent to Ukraine will be equipped with an upgraded version of the AN/APG-66 radar, which has an air-to-air range larger than 60 miles. Talk about having eyes in the sky. Here's just some of the armaments the F-16 will be equipped with. One M61A1 Vulcan 20mm Gatling-style rotary cannon with over 500 rounds. AN/AAQ-13 and AN/AAQ-14 land-tier navigation and targeting pods, up to 4 LAU-61, LAU-68, LAU-5003 or LAU-10 rocket pods, up to 6 air-to-air missiles, including the AIM-9 Sidewinder, up to 6 air-to-surface missiles, including the AGM-65 Maverick, up to 4 anti-ship missiles, including the AGM-84 Harpoon, and up to 12 bombs, including the B-83 nuclear bomb. It's also important to note that the F-16, like most Western aircraft, are significantly more pilot-friendly than Soviet-made aircraft. Though this is notable in and of itself, it becomes crucial to the Russo-Ukrainian war, as pilot training is one of the major obstacles Ukraine has to overcome if the F-16s are to make any difference. But more on that later. For now, let's stick to the F-16's pilot friendliness. The F-16 boasts intuitive controls and displays that are designed to reduce pilot workload and enhance situational awareness. Simply put, the F-16 jets are designed to do more with less work. All the controls the pilot needs are easily accessible and logically arranged, allowing the pilot to make split-second decisions in high-stress situations. And the pilots flying over Ukraine are sure to have their fair share of such situations. But there's another crucial reason why Ukraine wants the F-16 fighter jets in particular. As mentioned, these are Western-made jets primarily used by Western air forces, including the NATO countries. For Ukraine, using the F-16s means improved interoperability and compatibility with NATO forces. That's why the country hasn't gone for the Swedish-made Saab JAS-39 Gripen or French-made Dassault Rafale fighter jets. Though also Western-made, these jets are barely used by NATO countries. Of course, mere interoperability and compatibility with NATO countries is far from the end goal. The end goal is for Ukraine to become one of those countries. So what's the wait? Why haven't the F-16s been provided to Ukraine as soon as Zelensky requested them so we can speed this whole process along? Well, remember who Ukraine and the West are dealing with: Russia. Do you really think the Eastern Colossus would sit idly by while Ukraine receives decisive Western weapons and moves closer to NATO? Not a chance. According to Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko, the supply of F-16s to Ukraine would carry enormous risks for Western countries involved. He also labeled this transaction a move up the so-called escalation ladder, accusing Western forces of pushing for an escalation scenario. As for Russia, Grushko claims the country will take the F-16 acquisition into account in all its plans and that it has all the necessary means to achieve the set goals. Given how unpredictable Russia is, it shouldn't be surprising that even these vague warnings are taken seriously by Western powers. After all, we're talking about the country that went through with the invasion of Ukraine when virtually the whole world claimed it wouldn't dare. That's why the road of the F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine has been rather slow. But how many of these fighter jets should make their way to Ukraine in the first place? In other words, how many F-16s does Ukraine need to achieve air superiority? If you ask Kyiv, the answer is 200. That's the figure Ukrainian officials mentioned in January 2023. That's also the number that would instantly place Ukraine in the top 5 countries in the world by number of F-16 fighter jets in their inventory. However, if you ask military experts this question, the answer will be much lower, 50% lower to be precise. Around 100 F-16s is the highest figure being bandied around that would give Ukraine air superiority. However, according to some military experts, even 24 F-16s would be enough to make a difference and bolster Ukraine's air power in a meaningful way. But the number of F-16 fighter jets Ukraine will receive doesn't really matter, not if they don't come with the necessary training, support, and infrastructure to effectively utilize these aircraft. Just look at it this way. Ukraine can receive 1,000 of these aircraft and overtake the US as the country with the most F-16s, but if it lacks the expertise and infrastructure to maintain and operate them, the jets would be little more than expensive decorations. That's why military experts are adamant about one thing. Acquiring F-16 fighter jets won't give Ukraine air superiority over Russia, well, at least not automatically. To reach this endlessly desirable goal of air superiority, Ukraine would first have to lay the groundwork for these efforts. But what does the groundwork refer to in this situation? The first aspect, unsurprisingly, is adequate training. When discussing how many F-16s Ukraine would need to make a difference, a former British Royal Air Force officer said the country would need dozens of competently operated F-16s. Of course, competently operated is the key phrase here, as you can't expect Ukrainian pilots just to hop in the F-16 jets and conquer the skies above. To do that, they must first be trained. And this training doesn't take days or weeks, it takes months. 18 months to be precise, according to Colin Kahl, the Pentagon's former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and that's the best-case scenario. But why will this training take so long? After all, an average new F-16 pilot should learn the ropes in about 8 months. Well, unfortunately, there are numerous aggravating circumstances when it comes to training Ukrainian pilots. For starters, not all of these pilots are proficient in English, which significantly extends the duration of their training. That's why the pilots sent for the first rounds of training were cherry-picked based on their strong English language skills. It's also important to note that the number of these pilots was quite limited, and this doesn't have to do with their language skills. Ukraine simply couldn't afford to take too many pilots away from the battlefield, which is another factor contributing to the prolonged training process. Other than that, learning a new system can be tough, even for experienced pilots. They must be trained to the point that they can commit the movements to muscle memory. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to act and react quickly and effectively under pressure. For pilots with less experience, the training process is even more challenging, as they first have to familiarize themselves with the F-16 aircraft in a classroom. This part of the training typically lasts about 3 weeks. Over the next month, aspiring F-16 pilots are eased into flying the jet. The training starts with basic daytime flying and moves into nighttime, bad weather, and instrument flying, all technically demanding aspects of flying. Then it's time for the star of the show: air combat. This is where pilots learn to engage in aerial dogfights, employ air-to-air weapon systems, and practice evasive maneuvers. After 6 to 8 weeks of air combat instruction, air-to-ground training ensues. This training takes another 2 months. As you can see, the months are passing by, and we're still in the basic instruction domain. It will take several more months for Ukrainian pilots to learn how to carry out specialized missions and advanced tactics, such as coordinating with ground units and carrying out multi-aircraft missions. Given how complex this training is, it was of vital importance for it to start as early as possible, and luckily, it did. The list of countries pledging to train or already training Ukrainian pilots includes Poland, the US, the UK, Denmark, and the Netherlands. According to reports, the 12 pilots undergoing training in the US are expected to complete their program by May 2024, marking the earliest completion date in the ongoing Ukrainian training initiatives. In contrast, most pilots trained in Europe are not expected to finish until late 2024, despite 10 pilots recently completing their training in the UK. There are also 6 advanced pilots trained in Denmark that could be ready much earlier. But pilots aren't the only personnel trained. Ukrainian ground crews must also learn how to service the aircraft. After all, an average F-16 jet is only flyable 25 to 50% of the time. In the meantime, it's being serviced. According to some estimates, each F-16 needs about 20 maintenance hours between flights, which explains the need for a well-trained ground crew to keep the jets operational and mission-ready. Also, a huge part of laying the groundwork doesn't even have to do with people. It has to do with, well, the ground. You see, F-16s require smoother runways, centralized bases, and other specialized infrastructure to operate seamlessly. This means that Ukraine has to resurface its existing runways and consolidate bases to accommodate these aircraft. Now, this is a challenging task itself. However, it becomes nearly impossible when you consider it must be carried out without attracting Russia's attention. Russia's unwanted vigilance is another major obstacle to operating the F-16s successfully. At present, Ukraine can only use dispersed airfields and makeshift runways to fly its Soviet-era aircraft. If consolidated F-16 bases were to be used, they would become the primary targets of Russian airstrikes. This leads us to another vital aspect of laying the groundwork for F-16 jets in Ukraine, establishing sufficient air defense systems to protect the F-16 bases. And every defense system dedicated to these bases is a system drawn away from the Ukrainian front lines, which increases the risk of Russian advances in other areas. To make matters worse, defense isn't the only thing Ukraine must consider when it comes to the F-16 jets. The offense is no walk in the park either. You see, most of the Ukrainian existing weapons come from the Soviet era. This means that they can't be fitted on a Western-made aircraft like the F-16. In other words, besides the jets themselves, the Western allies would also have to supply Ukraine with missiles and other weapons for air combat. Fortunately, this process is also underway, with the US supplying Ukraine with the AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, HARM, as early as 2022. When fitted on an F-16, these missiles can target and destroy enemy radar installations, helping to suppress enemy air defenses and clear the way for other aircraft. Of course, these missiles are just the beginning. Ukraine also needs advanced air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles, precision-guided munitions, and other modern weapon systems that enhance the F-16's capabilities in various mission scenarios. Only with all these boxes checked, training, infrastructure, defense, and armaments, can Ukraine dream of achieving air superiority over Russia. But given how fiercely the country has been fighting for its sovereignty, this dream is bound to become a reality at some point. So let's see what F-16 fueled air superiority truly means for Ukraine. With the arrival of F-16 jets to Ukraine, the country's offensive and defensive capabilities will receive an immediate boost. This will transform the sky above Ukraine into a highly contested battlefield, forcing Moscow to change its operational strategy and stretch its military resources. In the air, Kyiv would be able to achieve two things almost instantly: securing local air superiority and preventing Russia from maintaining the overall air superiority. As far as local superiority goes, it refers to carving out specific areas where Ukraine can dominate for a few hours or even days. If you're wondering why the local approach, the answer is simple. Even with additional F-16s, the total number of aircraft Russia has outnumbers that of Ukraine several times over. To put this into perspective, all you need to know is that Russia has over 800 fighter aircraft. So even if Ukraine were to receive all of the 200 units it requested, Russia would still have 4 times as many aircraft. However, it's important to note that despite this massive discrepancy between Russia and Ukraine's air forces, Russia hasn't truly managed to establish foolproof air supremacy over Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. This surprising failure mostly has to do with poor training and numerous Russian attack aircraft touted as superweapons turning out to be useless in contested airspace. The result? The country's so-called supremacy was patchy at best, which is why we're even discussing a scenario in which Ukraine can take over the skies. Even with its outdated equipment, the Ukrainian Air Force has managed to dent its oppressors' air superiority efforts. So with the addition of the F-16s, Russia can kiss this superiority goodbye. Essentially, the F-16s would make the airspace over Ukraine too dangerous for Russia. Though to be fair, Ukraine has managed to deny Russia air superiority even before the F-16 jets entered the picture. Early in the war, Ukraine managed to shoot down quite a few Russian aircraft, causing the Russian Air Force to stop flying into contested airspace. Given that Russia cowed in the face of Ukraine's old equipment, it's safe to assume the country will be even more cautious when facing a modern and well-equipped Ukrainian Air Force with F-16 fighter jets in its arsenal. Before the F-16s, a Ukrainian aircraft going directly against a Russian aircraft in the air would almost always be considered a suicide mission. Now, with much faster and more maneuverable aircraft, Ukrainian pilots can turn the table on their adversaries. However, the biggest change caused by Ukrainian air superiority wouldn't take place in the air. Instead, the ground and sea battles would benefit the most. Sure, Ukraine won't be able to carry out NATO-style air campaigns immediately, which are known for integrating air power and other military capabilities. However, the country would be able to conduct well-selected precision strikes that could help it blast its way through Russian-held territory. Thanks to the F-16s and cluster rockets Ukraine has previously received, virtually any Russian target in this territory would be in Ukraine's range. This would allow Ukraine to take back some of its territory, which is currently impossible to do on foot. Why? Because Russia has planted landmines in a large portion of the occupied Ukrainian soil, making a land takeover another suicide mission. In this case, Ukrainian troops would die either at the hands of the mines themselves or Russian air attacks targeting them while they try to get over the minefield safely. But using F-16 fighter jets isn't only about attacking the enemy forces, it's also about defending Ukrainian troops. Currently, these troops are often devastated by Russian attack helicopters and fixed-wing glide bombs, but this could all change with the introduction of the F-16. In other words, the F-16 jets might be able to bring much-needed relief to the Ukrainian front lines, as these have been severely shaken up in the past few months. Though the situation at sea is much more advantageous for Ukraine than the one on the ground, the F-16 could help the country seal the deal in the Black Sea. For now, Ukraine has already managed to take out a significant percentage of Russia's Black Sea fleet with existing weapons and a whole host of asymmetric warfare techniques. With F-16 jets, Ukraine almost won't have any need for these innovative techniques. It can simply blast away. Attacking the Black Sea Fleet and the Kerch Bridge, connecting mainland Russia with Crimea with F-16-fired missiles, could even help Ukraine achieve its long-sought-after goal, taking back the Crimean Peninsula. Even without the F-16 jets in the sky, Russia has already pushed its Black Sea bases away from Ukraine. It's also withdrawn most of its vessels from the area, leaving a single ship, according to some reports. Though these moves can be explained by Ukraine's incessant military pressure, some experts also tie them to the imminent arrival of the F-16. This would mean that Russia itself is also well aware of the danger these jets pose to its military operations in the region. However, it's important to note that any significant change in the Russo-Ukrainian war won't happen overnight. Most experts don't see F-16s bringing Ukraine instant air superiority. Instead, they emphasize the importance of these jets in the long run. For starters, the F-16s will allow Ukraine to continue to have an air presence as the country's Soviet-era aircraft are being phased out due to aging, wear and tear, and attrition. They will also allow the country to carry out increasingly more complex missions in the future, several years down the road. Basically, this means that the F-16s are a long-term commitment toward building a stronger Ukrainian air force, even past the current conflict the country finds itself in. But when will this endeavor officially begin? Despite rumors circulating in December 2023, Ukraine still hasn't received a single F-16 fighter jet. However, this is bound to change very soon, in June or July 2024. Depending on when you're watching this video, Ukraine might have already received these jets and set off on the path toward air superiority. Interestingly, though the arrival of the F-16 jets is imminent, it's still not clear who will actually supply them. This probably has to do with the looming fear that Russia might interfere with the delivery process or even exact revenge against the sender. So for now, all we can do is speculate. Many experts believe that the first batch of F-16s will arrive from the Netherlands. After all, the country's Prime Minister Mark Rutte said that the Dutch government started preparing an initial shipment of 18 jets in December 2023. After the initial shipment, the country would send another 6 jets, as its total number of promised jets is 24. Denmark is another strong contender, as the country pledged to deliver 6 jets by the end of 2023. Obviously, this didn't happen. However, according to some reports, the deadline was pushed back by some 6 months, which would make the new delivery date sometime around June. These 6 jets would also be just the beginning, as Denmark pledged to send 19 F-16s in total. Belgium has also promised F-16 jets to Ukraine, but these likely won't arrive before 2025. Norway also has plans to send up to 10 F-16s to Ukraine, but the country hasn't discussed any fixed delivery schedule. As you can see, the list is missing one crucial country, which coincidentally manufactures these aircraft: the US. Though the US promised to approve any transfer of F-16s to Ukraine, the country didn't pledge to give these aircraft directly. The US has likely chosen to go through partner countries in Europe in an effort to reduce direct confrontation with Russia. After all, the US is widely believed to be the country's #1 enemy by a margin. However, the US will still be heavily involved in these transfers, beyond just giving them the okay. Together with several European countries, it will supply the hardware like munitions and additional equipment, make its jets and instructors available for training, and conduct this training on its soil. The other countries involved in this coalition include Canada, France, Greece, Luxembourg, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Sweden, and the UK. Let's say Ukraine does manage to achieve air superiority with the help of these countries. This outcome raises another important question: will air superiority be enough for Ukraine to win the war? Though Ukraine seems to think so, military experts aren't as sure. While no one can deny the strategic value of air superiority, victory in a war typically requires a much more extensive combination of factors, and in this case, most of these factors favor Russia. But what do you think? Do you believe the F-16s have the power to change the course of the Russo-Ukrainian war? If not, are they at least enough to guarantee Ukrainian air supremacy, or are we looking at a more favorable air situation at best? And what do you think Russia's reaction will be to the imminent arrival of the F-16s to Ukraine? Will this move only ramp up tensions, or do you see a more significant escalation happening in the future? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Now go and check out why Putin dreads the F-16, or click this other video instead.